I'm not leaving you, Sophie said, her voice cracking. Not until someone comes. You hear me? Not until someone comes. The woman trapped beneath the motorcycle didn't answer. She just stared up at Sophie with eyes that had seen everything and somehow still held fear. That was the night a homeless 19-year-old girl changed the course of her own life by refusing to walk away from a stranger's pain. Before we go any further, if this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment and tell us what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain had been falling for 3 hours before Sophie Williams heard the crash. She didn't hear it the way most people hear accidents, from behind glass, from the warmth of a car, from the safe distance of a life that had walls and a roof and someone to call. Sophie heard it the way she heard everything, raw, unfiltered, with every nerve ending she had sharpened by years of sleeping, exposed to a world that did not care whether she lived or died. She was tucked beneath the concrete overhang of the old Union Street highway overpass on the east side of Phoenix, in the particular corner she had claimed for herself over the past 7 weeks, because it blocked the wind from the northwest and stayed dry, even when the storms came in sideways off the desert. She had her sleeping bag pulled up to her chin and her backpack wedged under her left knee the way she always did, because 3 years on the streets had taught her that everything you owned could vanish in the 60 seconds it took you to fall asleep. She was 19 years old. She had been homeless since she was 16. And she had learned thoroughly, painfully, without exception, that the most important rule for surviving without a safety net was this: do not make yourself a problem for people who are bigger than you. Stay small, stay quiet, stay invisible. That was the rule. She heard the engine first, a motorcycle running too fast for wet pavement, the kind of speed that sounds different in rain, higher pitched, slightly desperate, like the machine itself knows something is wrong. Then she heard the tire catch wrong on something, a seam in the road maybe, or a patch of standing water, and then the sound changed into something she felt in her chest more than heard with her ears, metal against asphalt, a long, shrieking slide impact silence. Sophie sat up. She told herself not to move. She pressed her back against the concrete pillar and pulled her knees to her chest and told herself that whatever just happened out there in the rain and the dark was not her business, was not her problem, was something that the people whose business it was would handle. Police would come. An ambulance would come. Someone would come. That was what Sophie told herself for about 45 seconds. Then she heard the screaming. It was not the frantic screaming of panic, not the loud theatrical kind that people do in movies. It was smaller than that, which made it worse. It was the sound of someone fighting hard to stay conscious and losing ground, a woman's voice, low and ragged and terrified, repeating something Sophie couldn't make out over the rain. And despite every lesson the streets had ever taught her, despite 3 years of carefully constructed survival instincts, Sophie's body made a decision before her mind finished the argument. She was already moving before she knew she had stood up. The motorcycle had gone down about 30 yards from the overpass on the curve where the road banked slightly toward the drainage ditch. The headlight was still on, casting a tilted beam across the wet pavement, and in that light, Sophie could see the woman, or rather, she could see the lower half of the woman, because the upper half was hidden under the motorcycle itself, which had come down on its left side and pinned her from the rib cage down. Sophie stopped, every muscle in her body locked, because she could see the leather vest. Even in the rain, even in that pale, tilted light, she could read it clearly enough. The patch on the back, the death's head, the words around it that she had heard people on the streets whisper about, the way you whisper about things you are afraid to name too loudly. Hell's Angels. Sophie had been on the streets of Phoenix for 3 years. She knew the neighborhoods, the territories, the unwritten rules of who went where and why. She knew which shelter the city's social workers treated as a priority and which ones they pretended didn't exist. She knew which blocks belonged to which people. And she knew everyone on the streets knew that you did not involve yourself with the Hell's Angels. Not because they were monsters, not because the stories were necessarily true, but because they existed in a world that operated by different physics than the one Sophie survived in, and colliding with that world without understanding its rules was the kind of thing that ended badly for people who had no one to protect them. She stood there in the rain. The woman groaned, "Help!" The voice was almost inaudible. "Please." Sophie looked back toward the overpass. She looked down the road in both directions. There was no one. No headlights. No sirens yet. Just rain and darkness and the ticking sound of a hot engine cooling fast in the wet. "Please." The voice again, weaker. Sophie walked forward. Sophie walked. She dropped to her knees beside the woman And what she saw made her stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with fear anymore. The woman was older than Sophie had expected, maybe early 50s, strong featured face, silver hair plastered against her forehead by the rain. Her left arm was bent wrong. There was blood on the side of her face coming from somewhere above her ear, mixing with the rain and running down her neck in pale pink rivulets. Her right hand was pressed flat against the ground, and she was using it to push, trying to move the motorcycle off herself, and the effort was costing her something she couldn't afford to keep spending. "Stop," Sophie said. "Stop pushing. You'll make it worse." The woman's eyes found her. They were gray, those eyes, clear even now, focused. "Who are you?" the woman said. "Nobody," Sophie said, and she meant it. "I'm nobody, but I'm here." She did a fast, desperate inventory. The motorcycle was a large touring bike, the kind that weighed somewhere over 800 pounds stock, and it was lying at an angle across the woman's lower body, the heaviest part of the frame across her left hip and thigh. Sophie couldn't see the extent of the injury, but she could see that the woman's right leg was free and her left leg was not moving, which could mean any number of things, none of them good. She needed the weight off. She needed it off now before blood flow became a permanent problem, and she needed to do it without shifting the bike in a way that caused additional injury, and she had no equipment, no training, no upper body mass to speak of, and no idea whether she was about to make this dramatically worse. "I'm going to try to lift it," Sophie said. "You can't lift it," the woman said, not dismissive, just stating physics. "I know," Sophie said. "I'm going to try anyway." She looked at the bike, at the angles, at the points of contact. There was a piece of the crash barrier that had come loose in the impact, a length of aluminum rail, maybe 4 feet long, lying 2 yards away. Sophie grabbed it. It was heavier than it looked, solid metal bent at one end. She came back and wedged the straight end under the frame of the motorcycle, at the point she judged to be closest to the woman's hip, creating leverage she didn't have with just her hands. "This is going to hurt," Sophie said. "Everything hurts," the woman said. "Okay." Sophie gripped the rail with both hands. "Okay, when I push you, pull yourself backward. Can you do that? Use your right leg. Push with your heel." "I can do that." "On 3. The woman said nothing. 1. Sophie repositioned her feet for maximum base. 2. She drew a breath that tasted like rain and exhaust in wet concrete. 3. She pushed. The rail flexed under the load. Sophie pushed harder, throwing every pound she had into the lever. And for a sickening 2 seconds, nothing happened at all. And then the frame shifted, not much, maybe 2 inches, but enough. The woman grunted with effort and dragged herself backward across the wet asphalt with her right heel, and Sophie pushed again, arms shaking, vision swimming from the effort. And the bike groaned and shifted another inch, and the woman pulled again. And then her voice changed. The grunt became something else. A sharp inhale, and she said, I'm out, stop." And Sophie let the rail down. She stood there, breathing hard, hands on her knees, rain running down the back of her neck. "Can you feel your legs?" Sophie asked. "Left one's bad," the woman said. "Right one's fine." "Okay." Sophie was already pulling off her jacket. It was the only jacket she owned, a gray zip-up hoodie she'd found at a donation bin 8 months ago, soft and worn and exactly the right weight for Phoenix nights. She balled up the cleanest part of the sleeve and pressed it against the wound on the woman's head. "Hold this. Press hard." The woman raised her right hand and took over the pressure point. Sophie looked at her left arm at the angle of it and made the decision not to touch it. "An ambulance is coming," Sophie said. "Did you call one?" Sophie looked at her own hands. "I don't have a phone." A pause. The rain. "There's one in my right vest pocket," the woman said. "In her." Sophie reached in carefully and found the phone. The screen was cracked, but it powered on. She dialed 911 and gave the location and kept her voice steady, even though her heart was beating so fast she could feel it in her throat. The dispatcher asked her to stay on the line. Sophie said she would. She put the phone on the ground between them and took the woman's free hand in both of hers. They stayed like that in the rain. The woman said, "What's your name?" Sophie almost said nobody again. "Sophie, I'm Liz." "I know who you are," Sophie said quietly. Something moved across Liz Carter's face. Not quite surprise. Something more complicated. "Then you know what my husband is going to do when he finds out about tonight." "I don't know anything about that," Sophie said. "He's going to try to find the person who helped me." Liz's eyes stayed on Sophie's face, and he's not someone who stops looking. "That's fine," Sophie said. "I'm pretty hard to find." Liz looked at her for a long moment, at the hollow in her cheeks that came from not eating enough, at the layered clothing that was the homeless person's answer to not having storage space, at the hands that were calloused in the specific way that came from sleeping rough. And something shifted in the older woman's expression, something that was not pity, but was not pity either. Something that Sophie didn't have a name for because nobody had looked at her that way before. "Why did you help me?" Liz asked. Sophie thought about that. She thought about the rules she had made for herself. Stay small, stay invisible, don't make yourself a problem. "I don't know," she said finally. "I heard you and I moved before I thought about it. Most people would have stayed hidden." "Most people aren't me," Sophie said, and then because that sounded more confident than she felt, "I just didn't want you to be alone." In the distance, the first sound of sirens. Sophie felt it before she felt it, that old familiar clench in her gut that happened whenever official vehicles came near her. Patrol cars and ambulances meant questions. Questions meant systems. Systems meant people looking at her sideways, deciding what category she belonged, in what problem she represented, what needed to be done with her. She had been through that enough times. She had been handed to social workers who lost her paperwork. She had been placed in group homes that were worse than the streets. She had been told she was fine when she wasn't, and she had been told she was a problem when she was just a person, and every single time it ended the same way with Sophie, somehow more alone than she had been before. The sirens got louder. "You should go," Liz said. Her voice had changed. She had seen something in Sophie's face. "I'm staying until they get here," Sophie said. "Sophie." The way Liz said her name made her still. "The ambulance, oh, will take care of me. What happens to you if you're here when the police arrive?" Sophie said nothing. "I'm gonna go be okay," Liz said. "You gave me that. You don't have to give me anything else." The lights appeared at the far end of the road, red and white strobes painting the rain. Sophie squeezed Liz's hand once. Liz squeezed back, and for that 1 second, her grip was surprisingly strong. Then Sophie stood up and walked quickly back toward the overpass, staying in the shadows, moving the way she had learned to move, present one moment, gone the next, like she had never been there at all. She left her jacket behind. She didn't realize that until she was back under the overhang, sitting against the concrete pillar, with her arms wrapped around herself for warmth, watching the emergency lights move at the far end of the road. The jacket was still there. She had left it pressed against Liz Carter's head. She had left the only warm thing she owned in the rain, beside a woman she had known for less than 20 minutes. Sophie didn't go back for it. She sat in the cold and watched the ambulance workers move around the motorcycle, and she watched them load Liz onto a stretcher, and she watched them drive away, and then the police were there, and the investigators, and eventually they were gone too, and the rain eased off around 3 in the morning, and Sophie sat in the dark trying to understand what she had just done and why she couldn't quite make herself regret it. She was cold. She was hungrier than she had been before because the adrenaline had burned through everything she had. She had nothing that she hadn't had at the start of the night, except now she also didn't have her jacket. She pressed her back against the cold concrete and closed her eyes and tried to sleep. She couldn't, because something was different now, and she couldn't name it, and that unnamed thing sat in the center of her chest like an ember she didn't know how to put out. She told herself it didn't mean anything. She told herself tomorrow she would go to the donation bin on Morrison Street and see if there was another jacket. She told herself that she would forget tonight, the way she had learned to forget most things, not because she was cold or callous, but because the streets demanded a certain economy of emotional investment. You felt what you couldn't help feeling, and then you put it away and you kept moving. That was the rule. Sophie sat in the dark and waited for the feeling to go away. It didn't. Across the city, in a hospital room she didn't know, the number of Elizabeth Carter was being assessed by a trauma team who found 3 cracked ribs, a fractured fibula in the left leg, a significant concussion, and a deep laceration above the left ear that had required 14 stitches. Liz had answered every question the doctors asked, had submitted to every test, had held still, through the stitches without making a sound. And when Daniel Carter arrived at the hospital at 2:17 in the morning, having driven 90 miles an hour through rain that made the freeway invisible because nothing short of his own death would have made him drive slower when his wife was injured, Liz had waited until the doctors left the room, and then she had looked at him and said the only thing she had been waiting to say since the moment she woke up on that wet road. There was a girl. Daniel was still catching his breath, still in the leather vest he'd grabbed on his way out the door, still radiating the barely contained energy of a man who had spent the last 40 minutes afraid of what he would find when he got here. He sat down in the chair beside the bed and took her hand. "Tell me," he said. Liz told him. She told him about the sound of footsteps in the rain, about the girl's voice steady, no theatrics, just present, about the way Sophie had looked at the motorcycle and looked at the piece of crash barrier and made her calculation in under 10 seconds, because that was what you did when you couldn't afford to second-guess yourself. About the way she had pressed her jacket against Liz's head with both hands and said press hard with the directness of someone who didn't have time for gentleness right now, but would offer it the moment she could. About the 911 call she had made on someone else's phone when she didn't have one of her own. About the squeeze of her hand before she walked away. About the jacket she had left behind. Daniel was quiet for a long time after Liz finished talking. He was a large man, Daniel Carter, 52 years old, gray-bearded, with the hands of someone who had worked with them his whole life, and the stillness of someone who had survived enough to stop needing to perform anything for anyone. He was not a sentimental man in the conventional sense. He was not the kind of person who cried easily or spoke in soft tones about his feelings. But Liz had been married to him for 26 years, and she could read him the way you read a language you've spoken longer than you've spoken anything else. And what she saw in his face right now was something she recognized. He was moved, not just by the story, by what the story meant. "She's homeless," Liz said. "I know. She ran from the police. I know that too." "She doesn't know who you are," Liz said. "Or she does know, she said she did, but it didn't make her leave." Daniel was quiet. "I want to find her," Liz said. "I know." "Not because we owe her," Liz said. "We do owe her, but not just because of that." Daniel nodded slowly. "Because she needs someone to find her." "Yes." Outside the hospital room window, Phoenix was beginning its slow, wet gray recovery from the night's rain. The streets were draining. The sky was lightening somewhere far to the east. The overnight shifts at the hospitals and the shelters and the all-night diners were getting close to their ends. And across the city, scattered through the places where the visible world and the invisible world touched each other, the underpasses, the backlots, the spaces between things, thousands of people were sleeping in whatever position they had found, in whatever warmth they had managed to keep moving through another night, in the particular way that you had to move when the city didn't know your name. Sophie was one of them. She finally fell asleep around 4, huddled against the pillar arms, locked around her knees. She dreamed nothing, or she dreamed something and couldn't remember it in the morning. What she woke to was the sound of the first cars on the overpass above her head, and the way the changed light felt on her closed eyelids, and the cold that had worked its way into the spaces between her layers while she slept. She lay still for a moment the way she always did when she first woke up, running inventory before she opened her eyes. What did she have? What did she need? What was the plan for the day? Then she remembered the jacket, and then she remembered why the jacket was gone. She sat up and looked at her own hands. They were scraped from the crash barrier. She hadn't noticed that last night. The palms were raw in 2 places where the metal edge had caught her, and there was a bruise forming across the base of her right thumb from where she had braced against the road. She hadn't felt any of it while it was happening. She felt it now. Sophie looked at her hands for a long moment. Then she got up, rolled her sleeping bag, shouldered her pack, and walked out into what was left of the morning. 3 miles away in a house in the Arcadia neighborhood, Daniel Carter was on the phone. He had been on the phone since leaving the hospital at 5 a.m. He had made 11 calls. The calls had gone to specific people, not to all 240 members of the Phoenix chapter, not yet, but to the ones who knew the geography of the city the way a fisherman knows water. The ones who knew where the edges were, who had relationships with the people who existed in those edges, who could move through neighborhoods where a knock on a door from the wrong person would cause a door to stay closed, but where the right person could open things up. He had described Sophie once in simple terms. Young woman, late teens, blonde hair, blue eyes, slight build, has been on the streets for a while. Last seen near the Union Street overpass. He gave them one instruction. Find her. Not bring her in, not approach her. Find her first. Know where she is, then call him. By 8 in the morning, he had 15 people in the field. By 9, he had 30. By 10, he had the first piece of information, a shelter coordinator on McLean Boulevard, who knew the name Sophie Williams and said she hadn't been in for a bed in 6 weeks but was occasionally seen in the area around the Garfield neighborhood. By 10:30, a club member named Ray Donahue, who had a long-standing informal relationship with the staff at the Jefferson Street Food Bank, reported that the woman who handed out Wednesday lunches there knew Sophie by name and hadn't seen her in 4 days, but expected her before the end of the week. By 11, they had 3 confirmed locations where Sophie had been seen in the past 2 weeks. And at 11:27, a member named Torres, who had been walking the stretch of road near the overpass since early morning, called Daniel and said, "She was here last night, boss. That's her sleeping spot. She's not here now, but she'll be back." Daniel said, "Don't touch anything. Don't leave anything behind. I don't want her to think she's being watched." Copy. "This has to come from her," Daniel said, "not from us. She has to be the one who decides." Torres was quiet for a moment. "That's not how we usually do things." "I know," Daniel said. "This isn't our usual thing." What Daniel Carter did not yet know, what none of the 30 men in the field yet knew, was that Sophie Williams had already heard about the search. She had heard about it the way news traveled in the invisible city, which was faster than most people assumed, and through channels that the visible world didn't track. She had been at the Morrison Street donation bins at 7:30 in the morning, and an older man named Clarence, who slept under the van on the east side of the lot, had seen her and said he'd heard something that some bikers were asking about a blonde girl who'd been near the Union Street overpass last night. Sophie had gone very still. "What kind of asking?" she said. "Like they were looking for her," Clarence said. He studied her face. "Like they wanted to find her." Sophie thought about the crash, about Liz's hand in hers, about the thing she had seen on the woman's face when she looked at her, that unnameable thing. "Did they say why?" she said. "No," Clarence said, "but I heard they're Hell's Angels." Sophie closed her eyes for a second. Of course they were. She thanked Clarence and walked away in the opposite direction from where she'd been planning to go. She moved fast without looking like she was moving fast, which was a skill, the ability to cover ground without drawing attention to the fact that you were trying to cover ground. She cut through the parking structure on 7th and came out on Van Buren and stood against a wall for 5 minutes watching the foot traffic before deciding where to go next. She needed to think. She ran through the possibilities the way she always ran through problems, not from emotion first, but from consequence. If the Hells Angels were looking for her, what did that mean? What were the possible reasons? She had been present at an accident involving one of their members. She had touched the woman. She had used the woman's phone. The phone meant her fingerprints. The 911 call meant her voice. She hadn't given her last name, but she had given the location. And they would have been able to get there quickly, and the investigation would have been thorough. And if anyone had been watching the road before or after, Sophie pressed her fingers against her temples. She didn't know. That was the problem. She didn't know what she had walked into last night. She had no map for this. She had survived 3 years on the streets by understanding the rules of the world she was living in, and this was outside every rule she knew. A woman with a Hells Angels patch. 30 people in the field looking for her by mid-morning. The kind of search that was organized rather than random, which meant someone with real resources was running it. She needed somewhere to think. Somewhere she knew. She needed Margaret. Margaret Lewis was 61 years old and had been living without permanent housing for 8 years, which made her something of an institution in the part of Phoenix she occupied. She had an encampment in a parking structure on the south side of the Garfield neighborhood that she had maintained against all odds for 4 of those 8 years, and she ran it with an efficiency and a firmness that had earned her both the respect and the occasional exasperation of everyone who spent time there. She knew everyone. She knew the stories behind the names, behind the faces. She had seen people come through, and some of them she had watched leave, and some of them she had watched disappear, and she held all of it with a patience and a grieving that was one of the most dignified things Sophie had ever encountered. Sophie had met her 14 months ago. Margaret had given her a blanket the first night and asked her nothing. The second night, she had offered soup and asked one question. "What do you know how to do?" Not what happened to you, not where did you come from, not how did you end up here. Just what are you capable of? Sophie had thought about it and said she was good at finding things useful, things that people needed, ways in and out of places, people who had what other people needed. Margaret had nodded and said, "Good, we can use that." In the 14 months since Sophie had become something like Margaret's right hand, not out of obligation, out of the particular kind of love that forms between people who see each other clearly and find what they see worth keeping. When Sophie arrived at the parking structure, Margaret was sitting in her usual spot, the folding chair, with the taped leg, drinking coffee from a thermos that was more duct tape than thermos at this point. She looked at Sophie once and said, "You're moving wrong." Sophie sat down on the crate beside the chair. "I need to talk to you." "You're talking wrong too," Margaret said. "Sit down first. Drink something." "I don't have time to." "Sophie." Margaret's voice was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. "Sit down." Sophie sat down. Margaret poured coffee into the thermos lid and handed it to her, and Sophie held it with both hands and felt the warmth against her scrapes, and for a moment she just breathed. Now, Margaret said, tell me. Sophie told her. She told it the way she always told things to Margaret, without edits, without the instinct to make herself sound better or worse than she was, just a sequence of what had happened and what she had decided and what she didn't know. Margaret listened without interrupting. She was very good at that, Margaret, the kind of listening that was its own form of respect. When Sophie finished, the older woman was quiet for a moment. Your hands, Margaret said. Sophie looked at them. From the barrier. I can see that. Margaret reached under her chair and came up with a small first aid kit, the kind with a red cross on a white background, and she took Sophie's right hand and cleaned the scrapes with an antiseptic wipe that stung badly and then covered them with bandages that were slightly too large. Sophie let her do it. This woman, Margaret said, Liz, what did she feel like to you? Sophie thought about it. Real, she said finally. Real. Like she was looking at me, not at the situation I was in, at me. Margaret applied the last bandage with careful pressure. And that scared you? It wasn't a question. It scared me, Sophie said. Because, Margaret said. Sophie looked at the coffee in the thermos lid. Because real things can disappear. The situation things are easier to handle because they don't mean anything. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Sophie, what do you think these people want from you? I don't know, Sophie said. That's the problem. What are you afraid of? Sophie thought about that too. She was good at fear, not in the sense of feeling it often, but in the sense of knowing how to look at it directly and say its name. I'm afraid they think I did something wrong, she said, or that they want something back, or that this is, I don't know, some kind of test. I'm afraid of the way things change when powerful people get involved. And if none of those things are true, Margaret said. Sophie looked at her. If it's exactly what it sounds like, Margaret said. If the woman whose life you saved wants to thank you, what then? Sophie didn't answer. Because here's what I'm sitting here thinking, Margaret said. She folded the first aid kit closed and set it under the chair, and then folded her hands in her lap and looked at Sophie with the particular directness that was her version of tenderness. I'm sitting here thinking that a 19-year-old girl who has spent 3 years building a wall around herself the size of a building just spent a night taking it down brick by brick for a stranger. And then she ran away. And she's sitting here telling me she's scared, and I'm trying to figure out which thing she's really scared of. Sophie said nothing. Are you scared of the Hells Angels? Margaret asked. Reasonably, Sophie said. Or are you scared of someone actually wanting to find you? The silence that followed was long enough that a car turned into the parking structure and went up a level, and the sound of its engine bounced off the concrete walls and faded. Sophie looked at her hands. The bandages were bright white against the scrapes. Both, she said quietly. Margaret nodded, like that was the honest answer, and the honest answer was enough. Like she wasn't going to push on it or turn it into something it wasn't. Then let's sit here for a while, Margaret said, and you can figure out what you want to do. But Sophie didn't get the while that Margaret was offering. Because 40 minutes later, a car turned into the parking structure and didn't go up a level. It stopped on the ground floor. And a woman Sophie had never seen before got out, late 30s, dark hair pulled back, the kind of calm in her face that came from being someone's first call in a crisis, and she walked toward them without any of the signaling that Sophie had learned to read as danger. She stopped 10 feet away. I'm not here to push anything, the woman said. My name is Carmen. I work with a woman named Liz Carter. She asked me to find you if I could. A pause. She said to tell you that the jacket is at the hospital, cleaned and ready for you whenever you want it. Sophie stared at her. She also said, Carmen reached into her jacket pocket and took out a small piece of folded paper. She set it on the ground in front of her, not in Sophie's hand, not forced on her in any way, just on the ground where Sophie could choose to pick it up or not. She said to give you this. Then Carmen stepped back. 4 steps giving distance, like she understood or had been told that this needed to be Sophie's choice, every part of it. Sophie looked at the paper on the ground. Margaret did not look at Sophie. After a moment, Sophie leaned forward and picked it up. She unfolded it. The handwriting was not beautiful. It was the handwriting of someone who had written quickly or of someone whose right arm was working better than their left. It said, Sophie, you told me you were nobody. You are the furthest thing from nobody I have ever met. You don't have to see me, you don't have to talk to anyone, but I want you to know that I know you were there, and I am not going to forget it. Liz Sophie read it twice. Then she folded it back up and held it in her scraped hands and sat in the parking structure on the south side of Garfield while the morning moved around her and something happened in her chest that she hadn't felt in so long she had stopped expecting to feel it again. She didn't have a name for it either, but it was warm, and unlike most things in Sophie Williams' life, it didn't feel like something that was about to be taken away. Sophie held the note for a long time after Carmen left. Margaret didn't say anything. That was the thing about Margaret. She understood that some moments needed to be sat in, not talked through, not dissected, just inhabited until the person inside them figured out what they were going to do. She refilled her own coffee from the thermos and waited. Sophie read the note a third time. You told me you were nobody. You are the furthest thing from nobody I have ever met. She folded it again. Smaller this time until it was a tight square that fit in the front pocket of her jeans. She pressed it flat with her thumb the way you do with something you don't want to crease any further. What are you going to do? Margaret asked finally. I don't know yet, Sophie said. That's honest, at least. She's still in the hospital, Sophie said. Carmen said she's recovering. Carmen said a lot of things, Margaret said. Some of them might even be true. Sophie looked at her. You don't trust it. I didn't say that. Margaret turned her coffee lid in her hand slowly. I'm saying that hope is a thing you have to handle carefully. You hold it too tight, it breaks. You don't hold it at all, you lose it. There's a right grip, and you have to find it yourself. She paused. I'm saying be careful, not don't go. Sophie was quiet. She knew about the jacket, Sophie said. She described it, the exact jacket. Yes. She didn't have to do that. No, Margaret said, and she didn't. Sophie stood up. She picked up her backpack and settled it on her shoulders and looked at Margaret in the way that it meant she had made a decision and wasn't ready to say what it was yet, but that Margaret should know she hadn't made it lightly. Margaret said, You want me to come with you? No, Sophie said. This one I have to do myself. Margaret nodded, like that was correct, like she expected exactly that answer. Sophie, she said as Sophie started to move. Sophie stopped. Whatever happens today, Margaret said, you did the right thing last night. Whatever they tell you, whatever they offer you, whatever this turns into, it started with you doing the right thing. Don't let anyone make you forget that. Sophie looked at her for a moment. Then she turned and walked out of the parking structure into the late morning light. She hadn't told Carmen yes. She hadn't told Carmen anything. But the paper in her pocket had a hospital name in the top left corner of the note paper, the kind of detail that wasn't an accident, and Sophie had very good memory for things she read once and needed to remember later. She walked 11 blocks before she found a working payphone outside a laundromat on 12th Street, and she called information and got the number for the hospital. And then she stood on the sidewalk for almost 3 full minutes before she made the second call. The hospital switchboard connected her to Liz Carter's room on the second try. The phone rang 4 times, then a woman's voice rougher than it had been in the rain, thickened by painkillers and exhaustion, and the general indignity of being in a hospital. Hello? It's Sophie, Sophie said. The pause on the other end of the line was brief but complete. I didn't think you'd call, Liz said. I didn't think I would either, Sophie said. A short silence. Not awkward. The kind that comes between people who both have too many things to say and are choosing which one to start with. How are you feeling? Sophie asked. 14 stitches in a broken leg and 3 ribs that the doctor keeps describing as angry, Liz said. But upright, more or less. Another pause. How are your hands? Sophie looked at the bright white bandages. You knew about those too. Carmen described the crash barrier. That edge would have done a number on anyone. Liz's voice shifted, not softer exactly, but quieter. More direct. I want to see you, if you're willing. Sophie thought about saying not yet. She thought about saying, let me think about it. She thought about every version of let me put some distance between myself and this moment that she had ever used to keep herself safe. Okay, she said instead. Okay, Liz said. And something in the single word, the controlled exhale of it, the way it landed told Sophie that Liz Carter had been sitting in that hospital room all morning, working very hard not to push, and that okay was costing her something too. One condition, Sophie said. Name it. I come alone. No one outside the room, no one in the hallway who's waiting for something. A beat. Done, Liz said. Sophie took a breath. I'll be there in an hour. She was there in 40 minutes. The hospital was the kind Sophie had been in twice before, once when she was 17 and had a respiratory infection that had gotten too bad to ignore once when she was 18, and a man at a shelter had hit her with an open hand for no reason that made any sense. Both times she had discharged herself as fast as she could because hospitals meant paperwork, and paperwork meant questions, and questions meant the specific kind of helplessness that came from being dependent on systems that could decide what happened to you. She walked through the lobby with the deliberate neutrality she used for all institutional spaces. Not rushing, not hesitating, looking like she knew where she was going and had every right to be there, because the secret to moving through places where you felt out of place was to never let the place know that. Room 214. She stopped outside the door. Through the small window in the door, she could see Liz Carter in the bed, propped up against pillows. Left leg elevated arm in a soft cast from elbow to wrist. She was looking at something on the far wall. Her silver hair was clean and dry, now no longer plastered to her face, and Sophie could see for the first time what she actually looked like: strong-boned, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had been through things and come out the other side knowing something. Sophie pushed the door open. Liz turned her head. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just looked at each other in the daylight, in the quiet of the hospital room, and Sophie understood something she hadn't fully understood in the rain last night. This woman was exactly who the patch said she was, and also completely someone else at the same time. "You came," Liz said. "I said I would," Sophie said. "People say a lot of things." "I know," Sophie said. "I try not to." Liz looked at the bandages on Sophie's hands. She pressed her lips together briefly. "Sit down," she said. "Please." Sophie sat in the chair beside the bed. Not the comfortable one. There was a plastic chair near the wall and a padded chair closer to the bed, and Sophie automatically took the plastic one, the one that cost less to occupy, and Liz noticed that. "The other one," Liz said. Sophie moved to the padded chair. Up close, she could see the bruising more clearly. The left side of Liz's face had gone yellow-green along the cheekbone, fading from a deeper purple near the hairline where the stitches were. She was moving carefully, the way people do when they have learned very quickly that their body has opinions about what it will allow. "I want to know about you," Liz said, without preamble, without the softening that some people did when they asked for things they thought might hurt. Just straight. Sophie had expected something else. Gratitude, maybe, or explanation, or the careful social choreography of two people who didn't know each other pretending they had context. She hadn't expected this. "What do you want to know?" Sophie said. "How long have you been on the streets?" 3 years. "Since you were 16? "Yes." "Parents?" "My mother died when I was 15. My father was gone before that." Sophie said it the way she had learned to say it, without apology, without the catching in the voice that it used to cause. Not because it didn't matter, but because she had processed it so many times that it had become the shape of her life rather than the wound in it. "There was an aunt for a few months. It didn't work." Liz didn't say she was sorry. Sophie noticed that and was grateful for it. The sorry never helped. It just made the person saying it feel better about having heard something difficult. "School," Liz said. "Through 10th grade, then I was out." "Smart." Sophie looked at her. "Yes." "I can tell," Liz said, "the way you assessed the crash last night, the way you thought about the leverage. Most people would have just pulled. Pulling would have made it worse," Sophie said. "I know, that's my point." Sophie was quiet. "What do you do?" Liz asked. "Day to day. What's the structure?" And somehow that question, so specific, so practical, so completely absent of the condescension that usually came with people asking about her life, was the one that unlocked something in Sophie. She told her. The food bank on Wednesdays, the donation bins on Morrison, the informal network she had built over 3 years of knowing who had what and who needed what and how to move between those two things efficiently. The way she looked after the older people in the encampments because they were the most vulnerable and the least likely to ask for help. The system she had developed for staying warm in winter that she had taught to 7 other people in her first year on the streets. Liz listened to all of it without interrupting. When Sophie finished, there was a silence. "You've been running your own operation," Liz said. "I wouldn't call it that." "I would," Liz said. "That's logistics and trust building and resource management. That's exactly what that is." She paused. "How many people are you looking after?" Sophie thought about it. 12, maybe? More loosely. Margaret most directly. "Margaret, the woman I was with this morning, when Carmen came." Something moved across Liz's face. "Carmen found you." "She found the right place," Sophie said. "I was already there." Good, Liz said quietly. Like that mattered. Like she needed to know that Carmen had done what she'd asked without pushing. Then the door opened. Sophie was on her feet before the thought fully formed pure reflex, the kind that came from 3 years of needing to know every entrance and exit at all times. Her body had moved before her brain caught up, and she was standing 2 steps back from the chair when the man walked in. He was large, not threatening in his size, but present in it, the way some people are just more there than others. 50-something gray beard, leather vest, and the kind of careful, measured entry that told Sophie he had been told to make himself non-threatening and was working at it deliberately. He stopped just inside the door when he saw her on her feet. "I said alone," Sophie said. Her voice was flat, not frightened, flat. "Daniel." Liz said his name once, that was all. The man Daniel Carter, who Sophie had heard about but never seen, put both hands up in a gesture that was not performing, not theatrical. Just visible. Open palms. "I'm not a danger." "I know," he said. His voice was low and hurried. "My wife told me. I should have waited. I'm sorry." He looked at Sophie directly, not through her, not past her, at her. "I'm Daniel, Liz's husband." Sophie said nothing. "I'll go back outside if you want," he said. "That's not a negotiation. If you want me gone, I'm gone." Sophie looked at him for a long 3 seconds. She was reading him the way she read everyone, not for surface signals, but for the things underneath the small tells of body language and eye contact and the specific quality of stillness. He was telling the truth, not because he was performing it, but because he was too tired to perform anything. "Stay," Sophie said, "but stay there." He stayed there. He moved to the far wall, not to a chair, just to the wall, and he stood with his back against it and his arms at his sides, not crossed, not tucked open, visible as non-imposing as a man of his size and presence could manage. He was doing everything he could think of to make himself smaller, and it was costing him something. Sophie could see that. But he was doing it anyway. "I need to say something," Daniel said. His eyes went to his wife briefly, then back to Sophie. "I know you don't know me. I know you have every reason not to trust me. I know what my name means to people who've been treated the wrong way by people with power." He paused. "I'm not going to ask you to overlook any of that. What I am going to ask is 5 minutes of your time, and then you can walk out that door, and we will never contact you again if that's what you want. Carmen will not look for you. No one from our chapter will look for you, I give you my word." Sophie looked at him. "Your word," she said. "My word," he said. "Why should that mean anything to me?" She wasn't being cruel. She was being honest. "I don't know you." "You don't," he said. "That's fair." He didn't try to answer the question. He just held it. Sophie sat back down. 5 minutes, she said. Daniel Carter nodded. He didn't move from the wall. He spoke from there, standing like sitting down would have been taking something that hadn't been offered to him. "My wife has been part of our chapter for 23 years, he said. "She has done more for the people around her, our members, their families, the communities we work in, than any 10 other people I've known. She's not perfect, neither am I. Neither is our organization. But she is the person I trust most in this world. And last night she was lying on wet pavement in the dark, and she was scared. And you were the one who showed up." He stopped. "Not someone who owed her something. Not someone who had a reason. You, someone who had every reason to keep walking." Another pause. "I've been looking for you since 5 this morning because I needed to look you in the eye and tell you that." The room was very quiet. "Tell me what," Sophie said. "That what you did last night is the rarest thing there is," Daniel said. "I've been in this world a long time. I've known brave people. But brave people usually have something to protect. You had nothing to protect. You walked toward a stranger in the dark and stayed until she was safe, and then you walked away without asking for anything. That's not brave, that's something else. I don't even have the right word for it." Sophie was looking at the floor. "The jacket is at the desk downstairs," Liz said quietly. "Whenever you want it." Sophie didn't look up for a moment. When she did, her eyes were dry. She had learned long ago how to feel things fully, without letting them break the surface, a skill she was not entirely proud of and not entirely able to undo. But there was something in her face that she hadn't put there consciously, something that had come through anyway. "I don't need anything from you," she said. "I need you to understand that. I'm not here because I want something." "I know," Daniel said. "I came because she asked me to," Sophie said. "Not because I expected anything." "I know that too," he said. "Then we're clear," Sophie said. "We're clear," he said. And then, Can I ask you something? Sophie waited. Is there anyone, he said, anyone at all? Family? Someone who checks on you? Sophie thought about Margaret. I have people I look after, she said. That's not what I asked. She was quiet. No, she said. Not really. Daniel looked at his wife. Liz looked back at him. Something passed between them that was the entire shorthand of a long marriage compressed into a single glance. Then I have one more thing to say, Daniel said, and then I'll stop. He looked back at Sophie. You don't have to accept anything from us. You don't have to come back here. You don't have to have any more contact with us than you want. But I want you to know that there is a place at our table for you, permanently, for as long as you want it. Not because you saved my wife, not because we owe you. Because the world should be treating you better than it is, and we'd like to be part of fixing that. Sophie stared at him. This was the thing she hadn't prepared for. She had prepared for gratitude. She had prepared for overwhelm. She had prepared for the subtle, uncomfortable pressure of people who wanted to feel good about helping someone. She had not prepared for this, for the directness of it, the complete absence of performance, the way he said it like it was simply true, and he was simply stating it. I don't know what to do with that, she said. You don't have to do anything with it today, he said. It doesn't expire. She looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at Liz. Liz was watching her with those clear gray eyes that had looked at her the same way in the rain last night, not at the situation at her. My jacket, Sophie said finally. Can I get it before I go? I'll walk you down, Daniel said. They went down together in the elevator, the two of them, and Sophie was aware of the strangeness of it. This large man in his leather vest, this girl in her layered street clothes standing in a hospital elevator, not saying anything. He didn't try to fill the silence. She appreciated that. At the front desk, a nurse produced the jacket in a plastic bag. It had been washed. Sophie could see that no longer bloodstained, just gray and soft and worn the way it had always been. She took it out of the bag and put it on right there at the desk. Daniel watched her zip it up. Does it fit okay? He asked. Sophie looked at him. The question was so ordinary, so domestic, so completely disconnected from the weight of everything they just talked about that she almost laughed. It's my jacket, she said. Right, he said. Sorry. They stood in the hospital lobby. I need to think, Sophie said. Take all the time you need. I'm not agreeing to anything right now. Nobody's asking you to. Sophie looked at him once more. At the weathered face, the careful eyes, the hands that were at his side still open, still visible, still nothing to hide. Okay, she said. She walked out through the automatic doors into the afternoon. She was half a block fording the street before she stopped. She stopped because something was wrong. Not wrong like danger. Wrong like the thing you feel when the ground shifts under you and you have to recalibrate your sense of where level is. She stood on the sidewalk in her clean jacket with the bandages on her hands and the folded note in her pocket, and she tried to locate what she was feeling. She felt seen. That was the thing she couldn't process. That was the thing her whole body was resisting, not because it was bad, but because she had no architecture for it. For 3 years, she had been invisible, and she had built her life around the infrastructure of invisibility, the routines, the relationships, the careful, small ways of surviving inside a world that did not see you. And in the last 12 hours, 2 people had looked at her like she was there. Really there. Not a problem to be managed or a symbol of something larger or a cautionary story about what happened to kids who fell through the cracks. Just a person. Sophie Williams standing on a sidewalk with a jacket on her back and a note in her pocket and the feeling of someone's hands fitting a bandage carefully over her scrapes. She started walking again. She walked for a long time without direction, the way she did when she needed to think not toward anything, just through the city, letting the motion work through her. She walked through 3 neighborhoods and stopped for water at a fountain in a park, and then sat on a bench for a while, watching a group of older men play chess at a concrete table. They played fast, confident, slapping the pieces down with the authority of people who had done this so many times, the thinking had become automatic. She thought about what Daniel Carter had said. There is a place at our table for you, permanently. She thought about what Liz had said the night before lying on wet asphalt with her hand in Sophie's. Nobody should feel as alone as she had felt. No, that wasn't Liz. That was Sophie herself. That was what Sophie had thought last night before she stood up and ran toward the crash. Nobody should feel as alone as I have felt, the thing she had never said out loud to anyone. She reached into her jacket pocket and felt a folded note. Then she felt something else, a card. Small, stiff, slightly raised lettering. She pulled it out. Carmen must have put it there when Sophie wasn't looking. Or Daniel at the desk. She hadn't felt it happen. It was a phone number, just a number printed on plain white card, and underneath it a single line. When you're ready. No rush. No pressure. Sophie sat with the card in her hand for a while. Then she put it back in her pocket next to the note. By the time she got back to the parking structure in Garfield, it was mid-afternoon. Margaret was still in her chair with a different thermos, the slightly less taped up one she used for afternoons, and she looked at Sophie once and said nothing at first because she could read the whole morning in the way Sophie was carrying herself. You went, Margaret said. I went. And Sophie sat down on the crate. She leaned her elbows on her knees. She looked at her bandaged hands for a moment, then at Margaret. They want to help me, she said. Really help me. Not the shelter kind, not the system kind, the actual kind. Margaret was quiet. He gave me his word that if I walked away today, no one would look for me again, Sophie said. And I believed him. But you haven't walked away, Margaret said. No, Sophie said. Why not? Sophie thought about the chess players, the speed of them, the confidence of years. Because I'm tired, she said. It came out smaller than she intended, more honest. I'm tired of surviving. I've been surviving for 3 years and Margaret, I'm good at it. I'm really good at it. But I don't want to be good at surviving anymore. I want to be good at something else. Margaret didn't speak for a long time. The afternoon moved around them. Someone in the upper level of the parking structure was having an argument on a phone in Spanish. A pigeon worked the corner near the entrance with professional dedication. Somewhere 2 floors up, a radio played something Sophie couldn't identify. Then don't walk away, Margaret said finally. It's not that simple. No, it's not. Margaret turned her thermos slowly in her hands. But simple isn't what you need. Simple is what you've been doing. Surviving is a simple thing. It's the hardest simple thing there is, but it's still just one gear. Just keep going. Just get through the day. She paused. What you're talking about is different gears, and different gears are terrifying. Sophie looked at her. What if they disappear, she said. What if this is real right now, and then it's not? What if it is real and stays real? Margaret said. Sophie pressed her lips together. People have disappeared on me before, Sophie said. I know. My mother, my aunt, people at shelters who said they would follow up. I know, Margaret said again. Not dismissively, just holding it. This is different, and people, Sophie said. She heard herself say it and heard the question hidden inside the statement. Yes, Margaret said, it is. I don't know how to trust that. You don't have to trust it yet, Margaret said. You just have to not close the door. She set the thermos down on the ground beside the chair and looked at Sophie with the full weight of 8 years of knowing exactly how badly wrong things could go and deciding every morning to be here anyway. Can you do that? Can you just leave the door open? Sophie reached into her pocket. She took out the card and looked at the single line of text. When you're ready, no rush, no pressure. She put it back. Yeah, she said, I can do that. What neither Sophie nor Margaret knew, sitting in the afternoon quiet of the parking structure, was that Daniel Carter had not gone back upstairs when Sophie left the hospital. He had stood in the lobby for a few minutes, and then he had made 3 calls. The first call was to his vice president, a man named Frank Reyes, who had been with the club for 17 years, and who was the person Daniel trusted to translate his intentions into action without distorting them. The call was brief. Daniel explained what had happened, what he had offered, and what he needed Frank to do. Not push, not pursue, but quietly, carefully make sure certain doors were open when Sophie was ready to walk through them. Housing contacts, educational opportunities. The kind of infrastructure that took time to arrange and needed to be ready before it was asked for. Frank said she agreed. She didn't say no, Daniel said. For her right now, that's the same thing. The second call was to Carmen. He told Carmen what Sophie had said about Margaret and asked her to find out quietly without approaching, without pressure, whether Margaret Lewis might need anything that the chapter could provide. Not as a transaction, as a simple extension of the same impulse that had started this whole thing. Because Sophie had told him she looked after 12 people more loosely, and if you wanted to understand someone, you started with who they protected. The third call was to Liz. She came, he said. I know, Liz said. I heard you in the elevator. She took the jacket. I know that too. She's not going to make this easy, Daniel said. No, Liz said. She shouldn't. Easy would be the wrong answer. He was quiet for a moment. She's 19. I know. She's been doing this since she was 16, he said, building these systems, keeping people alive, 16 years old. I know, Liz said. Her voice was careful in the way it got when she was holding something that was too sharp to hold without care. Someone should have been doing that for her, Daniel said. Yes, Liz said. Someone should have. Another silence. She's going to be okay, Liz said. She's going to be okay, Daniel, because she's already okay. That's the thing. She got herself to okay under conditions that would have destroyed most people. We're not rescuing someone who's broken. We're finally showing up. Daniel exhaled slowly. Better late than never. For her sake, Liz said, let's make sure it's better. He said goodbye and ended the call and stood for another moment in the hospital lobby before going back upstairs. Across the city, Sophie Williams sat on a crate in a parking structure and held a card in her jacket pocket with one hand and thought about doors. She had spent 3 years closing them, carefully, efficiently, with the practiced precision of someone who had learned that open doors let in cold air, and people who said one thing and meant another, and systems that took what little you had left and called it help. She had become very good at closing doors. The card in her pocket was small and stiff and slightly raised, and it said, "When you're ready," and she had absolutely no idea if she was ready, and no way of knowing whether ready was even a real state she was capable of reaching, or just another word for the kind of trust she had stopped being able to generate. But she had not thrown the card away. She was still holding it. And somewhere in the space between holding and throwing away something was happening, something slow and tentative and frightening and real. Like the first light on the horizon of a night you weren't sure you were going to survive. Sophie Williams had not made a decision yet, but she had not walked away either. And for tonight, for this particular Tuesday afternoon in Phoenix with the chess players, and the pigeons and the radio from 2 floors up, and Margaret's steady presence in the folding chair for tonight, that was enough. She called the number on the 3rd day, not because she had decided anything, not because the fear had gone away or the questions had answered themselves or the architecture of distrust she had spent 3 years building had somehow come down overnight. She called because on the 3rd morning she woke up under the overpass and Margaret wasn't there. Margaret had gone to a medical appointment at the free clinic on Roosevelt, the one she went to every month for her blood pressure, and Sophie lay in her sleeping bag in the early gray light and felt the specific weight of a silence that had no one in it, and she thought, I am so tired of this particular silence. She walked to the payphone on 12th Street. She stood in front of it for 4 minutes. Then she picked up the receiver and dialed. It rang twice. Yeah, Daniel Carter's voice early morning, unhurried. Like he answered phones this way at 6:45 every day, and it cost him nothing. It's Sophie, she said. A pause that was not surprise, but was something close to it. Or maybe not surprise, maybe just the particular quality of a man who had been waiting for something and was taking a breath before he let himself believe it had arrived. Good morning, he said. I'm not agreeing to anything, she said immediately. I want to be clear about that. Okay. She stopped. She had rehearsed this and the rehearsal was suddenly useless. I have some questions. Then ask them, he said. Not on the phone. Another pause, shorter. Tell me where and when. She named a diner on Van Buren that she knew not because she ate there, she couldn't afford to eat there, but because she had sat at the counter twice when the afternoon manager let people without orders stay as long as they nursed a coffee. She knew the layout, the exits, the sight lines. She knew how to leave quickly if she needed to. 1 hour, she said. I'll be there, he said. And then Sophie. What? Thank you for calling. She hung up before she had to respond to that. She was at the diner in 20 minutes, which gave her 40 minutes to sit with a coffee she paid for with the last $2 from the emergency fold she kept in the inside hem of her jacket and think about what she actually wanted to say. The 40 minutes went fast. She was still working through it when Daniel Carter walked through the door exactly on time alone in a plain dark jacket instead of the vest. And she clocked all of that in the 3 seconds between when the bell above the door rang and when he spotted her. No vest, plain clothes. He had thought about what would make her comfortable and made a choice accordingly. She noted that. He sat across from her and ordered coffee and didn't say anything for the first 30 seconds, just settled into the booth, the way big men settled into spaces, getting comfortable without rushing it, and then he looked at her with those direct, steady eyes and waited. I need to understand something, Sophie said. Go ahead. Why does it matter to you, she said. Specifically, not the gratitude, I understand the gratitude, but what you said at the hospital about a place at your table. Why does that matter to you? What do you actually want out of this? He thought about it. She appreciated that he thought about it rather than answering immediately with something polished. Liz told me something the night of the accident, he said. She told me what you said to her before you moved the bike. She said you told her nobody should feel as alone as I have felt. Sophie went still. She said you didn't say it to her, he said. She said you said it to yourself, like you forgot she could hear you. Sophie looked at her coffee. She remembered that exact phrasing, he said, because in 23 years of marriage, she said she had never heard someone say something that true out loud without meaning to. He paused. That's why. Not because you saved her life, because you're 19 years old and you've already learned something that most people never learn, and you learned it the hard way, and that shouldn't go to waste in a sleeping bag under an overpass. Sophie was quiet for a long time. You're asking me to trust you, she said. I'm asking you to give it a try, he said. There's a difference. What's the difference? Trust is all or nothing, he said. Trying is incremental. You try one thing. If it goes wrong, you stop. If it doesn't, you try the next thing. You stay in control the whole time. She looked at him. And if I decide to stop, then you stop. No pressure. No one showing up looking for me. No pressure, he said. No one looking for you, so Your word, she said. My word, he said. Sophie wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. The bandages were looser, now the scrapes healing. She thought about what Margaret had said. Leave the door open. Just leave the door open. What does trying look like, she said. And that was where it began. Not with a declaration, not with a handshake or a formal agreement or any of the language that institutional help usually came wrapped in. It began with Daniel Carter taking out a small notebook, the actual paper kind worn at the corners, and asking Sophie a series of very specific questions. Not about her feelings or her history or her needs in the abstract. About logistics, what she needed most immediately, what she already had covered, what the gaps were. He listened and wrote and asked follow-up questions that were smart questions that showed he had actually processed what she'd said rather than waiting for her to finish talking so he could offer what he'd already decided she needed. And Sophie, who had sat across from social workers and case managers and well-meaning volunteers too many times to count, found herself noticing the difference in her body before she noticed it in her mind. Her shoulders came down slightly. Her hands stopped gripping the cup. She was talking to someone who was actually listening. By the end of the hour, Daniel had a list. Sophie had nothing signed, nothing committed to nothing that couldn't be walked back. But there was a list and a plan and a next step, and none of it had cost her anything. Yet except the willingness to stay in the booth for 60 minutes. She walked out of the diner into the morning light, feeling something she couldn't quite name, not hope exactly because hope was too large and too fragile. And she had been burned by it too many times to let it back in all at once. Something smaller. Possibility, maybe. The way possibility felt before it became hope. The seed stage. She was 2 blocks away when Frank Reyes fell into step beside her. She nearly bolted. Every nerve she had fired at once, the pure animal response of 3 years of learning. The people who appeared suddenly beside you on sidewalks were usually there for a reason, and the reason was usually bad. She had already mapped the distance to the nearest turning and calculated whether she could get there before he could follow when he said in a voice calibrated very carefully to be non-threatening. Sophie, I'm Frank, Daniel's VP. He sent me because he wanted you to have another contact in case you need something and can't reach him. He kept walking beside her at her pace, hands out of his pockets, not touching her, giving her the whole sidewalk if she wanted it. I'm not trying to crowd you. I know this is too much right now. I just wanted to introduce myself so that if you see my face somewhere, you know who I am. Sophie had stopped moving, which meant Frank had stopped too. 3 feet ahead of her, turned halfway toward her. She looked at him. Late 40s, compact brown skin, the same careful stillness that Daniel had. The kind of stillness that was trained, not natural. The stillness of someone who had learned to manage the space they occupied because they understood how others perceived them. He sent you, she said. Yes. He could have told me you might do this, she said. In the diner. He could have warned me. Frank's expression shifted. Something that was not quite embarrassment, but was in the neighborhood of it. You're right, he said. That was our mistake. I'm sorry. Sophie looked at him for another second. Okay, she said. I know your face now. That's all I needed, he said. She walked away. She made it to the end of the block before she stopped and turned back. Frank was still there, not following, just standing. If I need something, she said, What do I do? Frank reached into his jacket and produced a card. Same plain white as Daniel's, same single phone number, just a different name. He set it on top of a newspaper box beside him and stepped back. Sophie walked back, picked it up, kept moving. She heard Frank exhale behind her, quietly, like he'd been holding his breath. That was the beginning of the second week. What followed was a period that Sophie would later have difficulty describing to anyone who hadn't lived something similar because it didn't have the shape of a conventional story. There was no single dramatic turning point, no clean before and after. It was more like weather changing, slow cumulative, the temperature shifting by single degrees until one morning you realized you were warm and you couldn't remember the last time you'd been cold. Daniel's list produced results in a sequence that was carefully paced, as if he understood that moving too fast would break something fragile. The first thing was simple, a storage unit paid up for 3 months on a lot off McDowell Road. A key arrived via Carmen with a note that said, "No strings for your things." Sophie stood outside the unit for a while before she unlocked it. It was small, clean empty. She put her spare sleeping bag in it and the box of things she'd been carrying for 2 years that she couldn't bring herself to leave behind: photographs, a book that had been her mother's, a folder of documents she'd been protecting since she was 16. She locked the door. She put the key in her pocket. She stood there and breathed for a while. The second thing was an introduction. Daniel asked if she would be willing to meet one person, a woman named Dr. Patricia Voss, who ran a medical outreach clinic on the South Side and who Daniel said had been a friend of the chapter for 10 years. Not a social worker, a doctor, a woman who worked with the people the system had failed. Sophie agreed to meet her. Dr. Voss was in her 60s, small and decisive, with the energy of someone who had long ago made peace with doing more than was strictly possible and had simply incorporated the impossibility into her schedule. She met Sophie in the clinic waiting room and shook her hand and said, "Daniel tells me you've been managing some informal health situations in your community. Tell me what you're dealing with." Sophie told her about the older people in the encampments, the blood pressure issues, the untreated diabetes, the wounds that went too long without proper care because the nearest clinic required ID that not everyone had. Dr. Voss listened with the same quality of attention Sophie had encountered in Daniel, and she had the same habit of asking follow-up questions that were smart and specific. "You've been triaging," Dr. Voss said. "I don't know the word," Sophie said. "Assessing and prioritizing, figuring out who needs what most urgently." Dr. Voss looked at her steadily. "How did you learn to do that?" "I had to," Sophie said. "That's the best answer," Dr. Voss said. And then, "Would you be willing to work with me not as a patient, as a community health worker? I can train you formally for what you're already doing informally. Pay you for it. Real pay." Sophie stared at her. "That's a job," Sophie said. "Yes," Dr. Voss said. "That's a job." Sophie looked around the waiting room. At the people in the chairs' faces, she recognized the particular quality of people who had been waiting for a long time to be seen by someone who would actually look at them. "I'd want to keep working with my existing community," Sophie said. "Not just the clinic, the people I'm already looking after." "That's exactly what I'm describing," Dr. Voss said. Sophie was quiet for a moment. Something was tightening in her chest, not painfully, more like the feeling of a hand held out in the dark and closing around something solid. "I need to think," she said. "Take your time," Dr. Voss said. "The offer doesn't have an expiration date." Sophie left the clinic and walked for an hour before going back to the parking structure. Margaret was there. Sophie sat down on the crate and told her everything in order, without editing the way she always told Margaret things. When she finished, Margaret was quiet for a long while. "A job," Margaret said finally. "Yes. With pay." "That's what she said." Margaret turned her thermos slowly. "Sophie, what are you afraid of?" "That it disappears," Sophie said immediately. "That something goes wrong and it disappears, and I'm further back than I started because I let myself want it. And if it doesn't disappear," Sophie pressed her lips together. "I don't have a plan for that," she said quietly. "That's interesting," Margaret said. "You have a plan for every bad thing and no plan for the good one." Sophie looked at her. "Maybe that's the thing to work on," Margaret said. That night, Sophie called Daniel from the payphone. "Liz," she said when he answered, "I want to talk to Liz, not about the job, about something else." "She's been hoping you'd call," Daniel said. "Hold on." A pause, some rustling, and then Liz's voice, stronger now. A week out of the hospital, the pain still audible underneath, but no longer the primary texture of how she spoke. "Sophie," Liz said. "How are you feeling?" Sophie said. Like someone dropped a motorcycle on me, Liz said. Which someone did. How are you feeling? Confused, Sophie said. About what specifically? Sophie leaned against the glass of the payphone enclosure and looked up at the night sky at the particular orange-gray of Phoenix at nightlight pollution, turning the dark into something that was never quite dark. About why this is happening, Sophie said. To me, why now? Why I've been out here for 3 years and nobody looked twice, and then one night everything changes. She paused. I keep waiting for the part where it makes sense. Liz was quiet for a moment. Can I tell you something? Yes. It doesn't make sense, Liz said. That's the honest answer. Life doesn't work on schedule. Things don't happen when they're supposed to. Sometimes the thing that changes everything happens on a random Tuesday in the rain, and there's no reason for the timing, and there's no cosmic explanation. It just happened. Another pause. But you were there. That's the part that matters. You were there and you made a choice, and now we're here. That's the whole story. Sophie said nothing for a moment. I'm scared, she said. It was the first time she had said that word out loud to anyone since she couldn't remember when. I know, Liz said. I'm scared of wanting things that disappear. I know that too, Liz said. Do you know what I was scared of when I was lying under that motorcycle? She didn't wait for Sophie to answer. I was scared that no one would come, that I would be there alone in the dark and no one would come. A beat. And then you came. You came because you could not come, because that's who you are. Her voice was steady and sure. People like you don't disappear, Sophie. People like you are the ones who stay. The line was quiet. You think I should take the bah, Sophie said. I think you should do whatever feels true to you, Liz said. But yes, I think you should take the job. Sophie took a breath. I'll think about it tonight. That's all anyone can ask. She hung up and stood for a while longer looking at the orange-gray sky. She thought about the chess players, the speed and confidence of years, how you got there not by being unafraid, but by playing so many games that the fear stopped being louder than the game. She called Dr. Voss's number the next morning. I'll do it, she said when the doctor answered. Good, Ed, Dr. Voss said. Can you start next Monday? Yes, Sophie said. I can start Monday. She hung up and stood with both hands against the payphone and breathed. And then something happened that she had not anticipated and had no way to prepare for because it came from outside the story she had been telling herself about what all of this was. It came from Clarence. Clarence, who slept under the van at the Morrison donation bins. Clarence, who had been the first one to warn her about the bikers looking for her. Clarence, who Sophie had been bringing food to every Wednesday for the better part of a year because he had bad knees and the walk to the food bank was hard, and he never complained about it, but she had learned to read what people didn't complain about. Clarence found her that afternoon and he was moving wrong, not his knees, something else, something in his face. Someone's been asking about you, he said. Sophie's attention sharpened immediately. Who? Not the bikers, Clarence had said. Someone else, younger guy, 30s maybe, asking about the girl who was near the overpass the night of the motorcycle crash. He paused. Sophie, he wasn't asking like he wanted to thank you. She went still. What was he asking? He was asking whether anyone saw you there, whether you saw the accident, whether you'd talked to anyone about what you saw. Clarence's voice had dropped. He said he was a journalist, but he was paying for answers. Cash. And journalists don't usually pay. Sophie felt something cold move through her. Did anyone say anything, she said. I didn't, Clarence said. Nobody in our group did, but he went down to the Jefferson Street Food Bank. And you know how it is there? Not everybody knows to keep quiet. Sophie's mind was moving fast, now running through it. Someone who wasn't a journalist but was using that cover, asking specifically about who had witnessed the crash, asking about whether she had seen something or said something, paying for information. The accident had not been random. She had not let herself think about that before. She had focused on Liz, on the aftermath, on the slow, terrifying possibility of something good. She had not stopped to ask why the accident had happened. She needed to talk to Daniel. She called Frank first because she had Frank's number in her pocket and because the thing Clarence had told her felt too urgent to wait for a regular call to Daniel's number and be held in a queue. Frank picked up on the second ring. It's Sophie. I need to talk to Daniel now. Frank heard something in her voice. He didn't ask questions. I'll have him call you back in 2 minutes. Where are you? She gave the intersection. Daniel called in 90 seconds. She told him what Clarence had said, all of it exactly as she had heard it. When she finished, there was a silence on Daniel's end that was different from his usual silences. It was shorter and harder. How long ago, he said. Today, this afternoon. At the food bank. Yes. Another short silence. Then, Sophie, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Okay. The night of the crash, before you heard the impact, did you see anything on the road? Another vehicle? Anything that seemed off? Sophie went back to that night in her mind. The rain, the engine sound running too fast, the change in sound before the impact. She had not thought about it carefully before she had been focused on what came after, not on the sequence itself. But now she did think about it. There was a car, she said slowly, before the crash, maybe 30 seconds before. I heard it because it was moving slow for the conditions. Everyone else was going fast because of the rain, and this car was going slow. She paused. It was gone before I ran out. I didn't think about it. Daniel was very quiet. Did the accident investigation find anything? Sophie said. The official report says she lost control on a wet surface, Daniel said. His voice was careful and even in the way it got when he was managing something underneath. We've had our own questions about that since the night it happened. Liz is an experienced rider. She has been riding in Phoenix rain for 20 years. Sophie processed that. Someone ran her off the road, she said. Daniel didn't confirm it out loud. He didn't deny it either. I don't want you going back to the overpass, he said, or the donation bins, or Jefferson Street, not until we know more about who this man is. That's where I live, Sophie said. I know, he said. That's why I'm asking you to let us help with that, right now, tonight. Sophie pressed her hand flat against the side of the payphone. She thought about everything she had been building, the careful, incremental, one-step-at-a-time structure of the past 2 weeks. The storage unit, the meeting with Dr. Voss, the job that started Monday, the door she had agreed to leave open. She thought about what it would mean to close it again now, to disappear back into invisibility, back into the infrastructure of staying small and staying quiet. She couldn't do it. Not because she wasn't afraid. She was afraid. She was afraid in the specific, focused way she got when a situation had real edges and she could feel exactly where the danger was. But 3 years ago, she would have already been moving, already calculating the fastest route to somewhere else, already working the math of how to become someone no one could find. And she wasn't moving. She was standing at a payphone in Phoenix holding the receiver against her ear and trusting, really trusting, for the first time in longer than she could measure, that the person on the other end was someone she could afford to trust. Okay, she said. What do you need me to do? Stay where you are, Daniel said. Frank will be there in 10 minutes. Daniel, her voice stopped him before he could hang up. Who would want to hurt Liz? A pause, Mushigan. That's what we've been trying to find out, he said. And we're closer than we were a week ago. Is she safe at home? She's not alone, he said. She hasn't been alone since she came home from the hospital. Okay, Sophie exhaled. Okay. Frank arrived in 8 minutes. He pulled up to the curb in a truck, plain no club markings, and he got out and stood by the door and waited for Sophie to come to him rather than walking toward her. And she noted that too, the same consideration, the same deliberate giving of space that seemed to be the language everyone in Daniel Carter's orbit had been taught to speak around her. She got in the truck. Frank drove and didn't force conversation. Sophie sat with her hands in her lap and thought about the slow car 30 seconds before the crash, and about a man with cash asking questions at the food bank, and about the difference between a rainy night accident and something else entirely. Where are we going? She said. Daniel's house, Frank said. Unless you want somewhere else. No, she said. That's fine. Frank glanced at her sideways. You sure? I'm sure, she said. He nodded and drove. It was the first time Sophie Williams had agreed to go somewhere she had never been with people she had only just begun to trust in response to a threat she did not yet fully understand. 3 weeks ago, she would have called that a catastrophic failure of her survival protocol. Right now, it felt like the most rational decision she had made in years, because the thing she understood, the thing that 3 years on the streets had actually taught her underneath all the rules about staying small and staying invisible, was that survival wasn't the goal. It had never been the goal. The goal was getting to the place where survival was no longer the only thing you were doing, where you could lift your head and see past the next 12 hours. She was lifting her head. And what she could see past the fear and the uncertainty and the threat of whoever was paying cash for information about her at the Jefferson Street Food Bank, what she could see sitting in the passenger seat of Frank Reyes's truck as it moved through the early evening streets of Phoenix was something she had not been able to see clearly from the ground, that she was not alone on. For the first time in 3 years, she was genuinely, substantially not alone. The truck moved through the city, and the city moved around it, and Sophie Williams kept her hands in her lap and breathed and let herself be taken somewhere she had not been before. And for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, she did not spend the whole drive planning how to leave. Daniel Carter's house was not what Sophie had imagined. She hadn't let herself imagine much. Imagining things in detail was a habit she had broken early because detailed imagination led to expectation, and expectation led to the specific kind of pain that came from wanting something precise and losing it. But whatever vague shape she had allowed herself, the reality was quieter than it. Smaller, more ordinary. The kind of house where someone actually lived rather than performed living. Liz was in the front room when Frank brought Sophie in. She was in a recliner with her left leg elevated, a blanket across her lap, looking like someone who had been told to rest and was tolerating it badly. When she saw Sophie, she started to get up and then thought better of it, and the visible decision, the conscious choice to stay seated rather than aggravate the leg, told Sophie more about how much pain Liz was still in than anything the woman would have said directly. "Sit down," Sophie said. "Please." "I was going to say the same to you," Liz said. Sophie sat on the couch across from her. Frank stayed near the door, quiet. Daniel came in from the back of the house and pulled a chair close and sat with his elbows on his knees, which was his thinking posture Sophie had already learned. He wore it when he was working through something he hadn't finished working through. "Tell me everything Clarence said," Daniel said, "from the beginning." Sophie told it again. She was good at that, at keeping the sequence exact, at not adding interpretation to the facts until the facts were fully out. Daniel listened without interrupting. Liz listened too, her eyes on Sophie's face with that particular quality of attention that Sophie had decided was just how Liz Carter listened to things that mattered. When Sophie finished, Daniel looked at Frank. "Donahue's contacted the police department," Daniel said. "Has he come back with anything yet?" "This afternoon," Frank said. "The skid pattern on the road doesn't match a standard loss of control slide. The angle's wrong. Someone who knew what they were looking at and wasn't trying not to see it would call it consistent with a vehicle making contact and forcing a lean." The room was quiet. Liz said, "Someone hit me." Not a question, not surprise. The tone of someone who had suspected something for 2 weeks and was now being confirmed. "We think so," Daniel said. "Who?" Liz said. "That's what we're working on," Daniel said. But Sophie's description of the slow car that fits, a vehicle that slowed to make contact and then accelerated away before anyone could get a plate. Liz looked at Sophie. "You saw it." "I heard it," Sophie said. "I didn't see it. It was raining hard. I just noticed it was moving wrong for the conditions." "But you remembered it," Liz said, when Daniel asked. "I remember most things," Sophie said. "It's a survival habit." Liz was quiet for a moment, looking at her. "Sophie, what you've just given us, that detail about the car, that's the piece we didn't have. The piece the official investigation didn't have because nobody thought to ask the right person in the right place." "I didn't know it mattered," Sophie said. "Neither did we," Liz said. "Until now." Daniel stood up and moved to the window and stood with his back to the room for a moment, and Sophie watched the set of his shoulders and read something in them, not anger exactly, but the particular tension of a man who had information he was managing carefully because he knew what he was going to have to do with it. He turned back. "There's a man named Victor Brass," he said. "He runs a distribution operation out of the West Valley. For the past 18 months, he's been trying to push into territory that's not his. We've had 3 confrontations, legal ones through channels about boundaries. Last month, Liz was the one who negotiated the final agreement that held him back." He paused. "The agreement made him look weak in front of his own people, and men like Brassy don't handle looking weak quietly." Sophie looked at Liz. "You did a deal that cornered him." "I did a deal that was fair," Liz said. "He just didn't like what fair looked like." "And now someone with cash is asking questions about who witnessed the accident," Sophie said. "Someone who isn't a journalist." "Someone Brass has sent," Daniel said, "to find out what evidence exists, what can be traced back to him." He looked at Sophie directly, which means they know someone was at the scene who wasn't in the official report. Sophie felt the chill settle in properly then. Not the vague unease of earlier, the specific cold clarity of understanding exactly what she was inside of and exactly how it touched her. They're looking for me, she said. They're looking for whoever was at the overpass, Daniel said. They don't have a name yet, but the Jefferson Street Food Bank is close, and people talk, and it's only a matter of time before someone connects the girl who helps at the food bank with the girl who was under the overpass. Sophie's hands were flat on her knees. She was thinking fast. So what do we do? Daniel sat back down. First thing, you don't go back to your usual locations. Not yet. You stay here tonight. Tomorrow we figure out next steps. Margaret, Sophie said immediately. What about her? She's at the parking structure. If Brass's people are tracking my connections, they'll find her. She doesn't know any of this. Daniel looked at Frank. Frank was already moving toward the door. I'll get her, Frank said. Where exactly? Sophie gave him the address and the specific location within the structure. The details that made it findable to someone who knew what they were looking for. She'll be suspicious, Sophie said. Tell her? Tell her. Sophie said the thermos needs refilling. Frank paused with his hand on the door. Is that code for something? It means I trust you enough to send you. Sophie said, she'll understand. Frank left. Daniel looked at Sophie for a moment. That's good thinking. That's just thinking, Sophie said. I do it when I'm scared. You don't look scared, Liz said. I learned how not to look it, Sophie said. Doesn't mean I'm not. Liz nodded slowly. What do you need right now? Honestly, Sophie thought about it. To understand what my options are. All of them, not just the ones you think I should take. Daniel leaned forward. Fair. Option 1, you disappear. New part of the city, new routines. We help you establish that. Brass's people can't find what they can't locate, and if enough time passes without them finding a witness, the trail goes cold. He paused. Option 2, you talk to the detective who handled the accident report. Give your statement about the slow car. Make it official. Once it's official, there's less reason to silence the witness because the information is already in the system. Less reason, Sophie said. Not no reason. Correct, Daniel said. Option 3, you stay close to us. You have protection, and we continue our own investigation in parallel. The goal is to build enough of a case that Brass becomes the target instead of a threat. Sophie looked at each option the way she would look at a map for the actual distances, the real terrain, not the version that was drawn to look shorter than it was. Option 1 is temporary, she said. I disappear and the problem doesn't. It just waits. Yes, Daniel said. Option 2 puts me in contact with the police, she said, which has a history of going badly for people like me. Daniel didn't argue with that. Option 3 means I'm inside something I don't fully understand yet, she said. With people I've known for 2 weeks, about a conflict I had nothing to do with. Yes, Daniel said. Oh, those are the real costs. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Liz spoke. Can I say something? Sophie looked at her. Whatever you decide, and I mean that whatever you decide, you are not responsible for any of this, Liz said. You did not cause this. You walked into it in the dark because you heard someone screaming, and now it's in your life because the world is not fair and danger doesn't check whether you deserve it before it finds you. Her voice was steady and clear and completely without self-pity. That being said, you are one of the most capable people I have met in 51 years of living. And I think you know what you want to do. I think you knew before you asked about the options. Sophie looked at her hands. The bandages were gone now, 3 weeks out, just the faint pink of healed skin at the palms. I'm not disappearing, Sophie said. I didn't think so, Liz said. Not because I'm brave, Sophie said. Because option 1 means spending the rest of my life checking over my shoulder for something I could have addressed. I've been checking over my shoulder for 3 years. I'm tired of it. Daniel nodded, not with satisfaction, with respect. Then we do options 2 and 3 simultaneously, he said. You give a statement to a detective I trust a woman named Ortega, who is clean and who has been building a case on Brasso for 8 months independently. Your information about the slow car connects to physical evidence she already has. And in the meantime, you stay close to us. And my job, Sophie said, Monday with Dr. Voss. Daniel didn't hesitate. Still Monday. Dr. Voss's clinic is on our southwest boundary. You'll have people close without it looking like you do. You'll live your life. You just won't be invisible doing it. Sophie was quiet. I want one more thing, she said. Name it. Margaret comes with me. Whatever arrangement I have, she's part of it. She's been on the streets for 8 years. She has health issues she can't afford to manage. If I'm getting help, she gets help. The room was completely still for a moment. Daniel looked at Liz. Liz looked at Daniel. Something passed between them that was fast and complete and didn't need words. Done, Daniel said. Sophie looked at him, at the steadiness of him, at the way he said that single word like it was simple, like it cost nothing to extend the same care outward by one more degree when the person asking had already shown him who she was. She felt something break open in her chest in a way she hadn't felt since she was 15 years old, and her mother was still alive and the world was still the size that it was supposed to be when you were 15. She didn't cry, but it was close. Okay, she said. Her voice was even. Okay, then let's talk about Detective Ortega. Frank came back with Margaret 40 minutes later. Margaret walked into the house and looked at everything in it with the careful, measured gaze of a woman who had lived a long time and learned not to assign trust faster than it was earned. She looked at Daniel, she looked at Liz, she looked at Sophie. You're all right, Margaret said to Sophie, not a question. I'm all right, Sophie said. You sent a large man to find I in the parking structure. I know, I'm sorry about that. He was polite, Margaret said, which from Margaret was a comprehensive character assessment. She turned to Daniel. You're Daniel Carter. I am, Daniel said. Sophie trusts you, Margaret said. I'm choosing to extend that to myself provisionally. Don't make me regret it. I'll try very hard not to, Daniel said. Margaret sat down in the chair that Frank had quietly vacated for her and accepted the cup of coffee that Liz had asked someone to bring from the kitchen, and she held it in both hands, the exact gesture Sophie always made with a warm cup, and she looked around the room and said, All right, tell me what's going on. They told her. All of it. Daniel walked her through the brass situation with the same directness he'd used with Sophie, no softening, no condescension, and Sophie watched Margaret's face while she listened, the way she absorbed information, the tiny movements of her expression that most people wouldn't catch. When Daniel finished, Margaret was quiet for a moment. This man Brassa, she said, he sent someone to the food bank. We believe so, Daniel said. Jefferson Street Food Bank, Margaret said. Sophie volunteers there. She has for 2 years. She paused. There's a man there, works the afternoon shift. He's been odd lately, asking things he doesn't usually ask. I didn't think anything of it, but she stopped. Everyone in the room focused on her. His name, Daniel said. They call him Pete, Margaret said. I don't know his last name, but he started asking 2 weeks ago whether anyone knew who was camped under the Union Street overpass. Said he was trying to organize outreach. She looked at Sophie. I thought it was just outreach. I didn't connect it. Sophie felt it snap into place. Pete knew my camp. He'd seen me there. If Brass's people found him and showed him a description, he could have pointed them directly at you, Daniel finished. The room held this for a moment. I need to call Ortega, Daniel said. He was already standing. Wait, Sophie said. He stopped. If you call her now tonight, it puts everything in motion immediately, Sophie said. She was thinking out loud, which she rarely did in front of other people, but the room felt safe enough for it. Once that happens, Brass's people know we're moving. They'll either pull back, which protects me but loses you evidence, or they'll accelerate. And if they accelerate, the first thing they do is find the last loose thread. She paused. Pete. Daniel looked at her. Pete probably doesn't know what he did, Sophie said, or didn't know what he was being used for. But if Brass's people think Pete is a liability, they clean up their loose threads, Frank said from the doorway. Yes, Sophie said. Daniel stood very still for a moment. Then he reached for his phone. I'll call Ortega and Donahue simultaneously. Ortega moves to bring Pete in for his own protection. Donahue covers the food bank tonight in case anyone comes back. He looked at Sophie. That's the right call. The fact that he was asking her, the specific fact that Daniel Carter, who had been running an organization for 25 years, was asking a 19-year-old girl who had been sleeping under a highway overpass 3 weeks ago whether he was making the right call, hit Sophie somewhere in the center of herself with a force that surprised her. That's the right call, she said. He made the calls, both of them, standing in the middle of the room without going elsewhere for privacy, which Sophie also noted he wasn't hiding anything from her even in the logistics. Ortega picked up on the second ring. The conversation was brief and professional and told Sophie, who was listening carefully, that this was a woman who was already oriented toward this situation, who had been tracking it for longer than tonight, who was not surprised by the new information, but was clearly energized by it. The call lasted 4 minutes. When Daniel hung up, he said, "She wants to meet with you tomorrow. Your statement about the slow car is the piece that connects the physical evidence from the road to a deliberate action. Without it, she has a pattern that suggests intent. With it, she has a timeline." "What time tomorrow?" Sophie said. 9 a.m. at the clinic if that's comfortable. "She'll come to you." "At Dr. Voss's clinic," Sophie said. "Liz called Patricia when we were figuring out the meeting with you," Daniel said. "They've worked together on community cases before. The clinic is a neutral space that Ortega already has clearance for." Sophie looked at Liz. "You set that up." "Partially," Liz said. "The rest set itself up. Before you knew any of this was connected to Brasa." "Before I knew all the details," Liz said. "But Sophie, I knew someone had run me off that road. I knew it wasn't weather, and I knew it wasn't my writing, which meant there was going to be an investigation, and an investigation was going to need what witnesses there were." She met Sophie's eyes steadily. "I wanted you to have somewhere safe to be when that happened. I didn't know the timeline. I just knew it was coming." Sophie stared at her. "You were protecting me," Sophie said, "while I was protecting you." Liz didn't answer. She didn't need to. Margaret from her chair said quietly, "How about that?" That night, Sophie slept in a guest room. It had a bed, a real one with a frame and a mattress and actual sheets, and she lay in it in the dark and stared at the ceiling for a long time because her body did not know how to release into softness after 3 years of training itself for hard surfaces. She lay still and breathed and let the strangeness of it move through her without fighting it. She thought about Brasa, about the slow car, about Pete at the food bank, who probably thought he was just answering questions from a friendly stranger, who probably had no idea that the information he'd passed along had sent people looking for a 19-year-old girl who had done nothing except be in the right place to do the right thing. She thought about Detective Ortega, who was building a case, whose case now had a new piece in it, a piece that Sophie had been carrying around in her memory without knowing it was evidence. She thought about Margaret in the next room, Margaret, who had agreed to be here tonight with the particular pragmatism of someone who had spent 8 years surviving by assessing situations accurately. Margaret, who had looked at this house and these people and run whatever calculus she ran and said provisionally because Margaret always said provisionally but said it like she meant it. Sophie turned onto her side. She thought about Monday, about Dr. Voss's clinic and the people in the waiting room and the work that was already hers in a way that no one could take back because she had been doing it for 2 years without any title or pay or recognition just because it needed doing, and she was there. That was still true. Whatever happened with Brass and Ortega and the slow car and the man named Pete, that was still true. She fell asleep faster than she expected to. In the morning, she woke to the sound of Margaret and Liz talking in the kitchen. Their voices were low and overlapping in the rhythm of 2 women who had decided they had things in common and were running through them efficiently. Sophie lay still for a moment and listened without being able to make out the words, just the cadence, and something about the sound of it was so ordinary and so far from ordinary at the same time that she had to press her eyes closed for a moment. She got up. In the kitchen, Margaret was at the table with real coffee, good coffee, the kind with a proper smell, and Liz was at the counter with her leg brace and a stubbornness about standing that Sophie recognized as characteristic. They both looked at Sophie when she came in. "Sleep," Liz said. "Eventually," Sophie said. "There's food," Margaret said with a tone that suggested she had already eaten some and approved of it, which from Margaret was significant. Sophie ate. It was eggs and toast, simple and real. And she ate more than she had intended to because her body had opinions about actual food that her mind sometimes forgot about. Daniel came in at 8:15 looking like he'd been up for a while. He poured coffee and stood at the counter and said, "Ortega confirmed, 9 o'clock. "I'm ready," Sophie said. "I'll drive you," he said, "and then I'll wait outside. You go in with Ortega alone if that's what you want." "I want Liz there," Sophie said. Liz looked up from the counter. "If that's okay," Sophie said. I know your leg." "My leg is fine," Liz said in the voice of someone whose leg was not particularly fine, but who would not going to let that be the deciding factor. "Then I want you there," Sophie said. Liz looked at her for a moment. "Okay," she said. "Then I'm there." Detective Rosa Ortega was smaller than Sophie had imagined, late 40s compact wearing the particular brand of permanent alertness that certain jobs installed and never quite removed. She shook Sophie's hand with the directness of someone for whom the social choreography of meetings was not a thing she had patience for. and she sat across from Sophie in Dr. Voss's small conference room and opened a folder and looked up. I want to start by telling you something, Ortega said. Before you say a single word about what you saw, you are not a suspect. You are not in trouble with my office. Whatever you saw and whatever you did after, you are a witness and a good Samaritan and nothing else. Is that clear? Sophie looked at her. Clear. Good. Ortega settled back. Now, tell me about the car. Sophie told her, in exactly the order she remembered it, in the exact words she had used in her own mind, when she reconstructed the sequence with the same precision she brought to everything she needed to remember accurately. Ortega did not interrupt. She wrote, and her pen moved steadily, and occasionally she would pause and look up with a follow-up question that was surgical, the exact question that pointed at the exact detail that needed more resolution. By the end, Ortega set her pen down and looked at Sophie for a moment. You'd have made a good detective, she said. I was a good survivor, Sophie said. Same skill set. Ortega almost smiled. What you've given me connects to road surface data we pulled from the accident scene. The angle of contact the tire marks the pattern of the debris, we had the physics of it. We didn't have the timeline. Your description of the slow car puts a vehicle in position approximately 30 to 45 seconds before impact, which matches the window our reconstruction needed. She paused. This is going to become a formal statement. Signed. Are you prepared for that? Sophie looked at Liz, who was sitting 2 chairs down and had not said a word during the interview. Liz's face was quiet and watchful, and when Sophie looked at her, she gave a very small nod, not telling Sophie what to decide, just confirming she was there. Yes, Sophie said, well, I'll sign it. Ortega produced the paperwork and Sophie read it, actually read it every line, which made Ortega wait, and which Sophie did not apologize for because she had learned at 16 that you never signed anything you hadn't read, and then she signed it and dated it and pushed it back across the table. Ortega put it in the folder. She closed the folder. She looked at Sophie. You know that by doing this, you become part of an active investigation, Ortega said. I know. Brass is going to know someone gave us the timeline. I know that too. You're not afraid, Ortega said, not challenging, genuinely asking. Sophie thought about the question honestly. I'm afraid, she said, but I'm done making decisions based on that. Ortega held her gaze for a moment. Then she said, Daniel Carter's people and my office have been orbiting the same case from different angles for 8 months. This is the first time those 2 angles have touched. She paused. That happened because of you. A 19-year-old who was sleeping under a highway overpass happened to be in the right place and happened to make the right choice and happened to remember the right detail. She looked at Sophie carefully. I don't use the word lucky easily, but I'm going to use it today. Sophie said, I don't think it was luck. What do you think it was? Ortega said. Sophie thought about the rain, about the sound she had heard, and the argument she had had with herself for 45 seconds, and the moment her body made its choice before her mind finished the debate, about the rule she had spent 3 years living by. Stay small, stay invisible. Don't make yourself a problem. I think it was the one time I stopped following the rule I made to keep myself safe, she said, and it turned out to be the right time to stop. Ortega was quiet for a moment. Then she closed her notebook and capped her pen and said, We're going to move on Brass within 72 hours. Your name will not appear in the public record until and unless this goes to trial, and by then we'll have enough from our own investigation that your statement is corroborating, not primary. You will not be the person Brass looks at first. She paused. But you need to stay close to people who can look out for you until we make the arrest. I'm already doing that, Sophie said. Ortega stood and shook Sophie's hand again, then Liz's, and she left the way she had arrived efficiently. No excess motion, like someone who had a great deal to do and had already begun doing the next thing in her mind before she had finished the current one. The room was quiet. Liz looked at Sophie. Sophie looked back at her. How do you feel? Liz said. Sophie thought about it honestly. She felt the weight of the signed statement in the room. The solidity of it, the way something that had only been in her memory for 3 weeks was now outside of her, in a folder, in a system that was actually going to use it. She felt the strange lightness of that, the unburdening. Like I put something down that I didn't know I was carrying, she said. Liz nodded slowly. That's what the truth feels like, she said, when you finally give it to the right person. Sophie looked at her hands again, the healed palms, the faint pink lines of where the metal had caught her. She had walked into the dark 3 weeks ago with these hands and moved a motorcycle off a woman she had never met, and stayed until help came and walked away with nothing except the cold and the lost jacket and the knowledge that she had done the only thing she was able to do. And now she was here, in a conference room in a medical clinic with a signed statement in a detective's folder and a job starting Monday, in a storage unit with a key and a room last night, with a real bed and 2 cups of good coffee this morning, and a woman sitting across from her who looked at her like she was exactly who she was and found that to be enough. Sophie Williams had not yet processed all of it. She knew that. She knew there was a great deal ahead, the arrest, the case, the adjustments and setbacks and learning curves of a life that was changing shape faster than she could fully track. She knew that Monday would be the start of something and not the end of something, and that the difference between those two things mattered. But right now, in this room with Liz Carter watching her with those clear gray eyes right now, Sophie let herself feel it. All of it. The fear and the exhaustion and the grief for the 3 years and the first terrifying edges of something she still didn't have the right word for. Something that lived just past surviving. Something that looked for the first time like it might be the beginning of a life. The arrest happened on a Wednesday. Sophie was at the clinic when Frank called. She was in the middle of helping an older man named Ruben, 63, diabetic, hadn't seen a doctor in 4 years, fill out the intake paperwork that Dr. Voss required before she could formally add someone to the outreach roster. Sophie had been coaching Ruben through it for 20 minutes because his hands shook badly and his reading glasses were broken, and he was deeply embarrassed about both of those things. And she had learned in her first week at the clinic that the paperwork was often the highest wall between people who needed care and the care itself. So she sat with him and read the questions aloud and wrote his answers in her own steady handwriting and did not make him feel small for needing her to. Her phone buzzed on the table. She had a phone now, a simple one, prepaid, acquired in her second week. She glanced at the screen. Frank. Give me 1 minute, she told Ruben. She stepped into the hallway. Brass is in custody, Frank said. 45 minutes ago, Ortega's team moved at 6 this morning. They took him at his distribution facility with enough to charge him on the vehicle assault and 3 other counts they'd been building. A pause. It's done, Sophie. Sophie stood in the hallway and pressed her back against the wall. Pete, she said, protective custody since Monday. He's cooperating. He didn't know what Brasa was using him for. He genuinely thought he was helping with outreach. Ortega confirmed that. Sophie exhaled. Clarence, she said, nobody touched him. Nobody touched anyone in your network. We had people closed the whole time. Sophie closed her eyes for a moment, just 1 moment. Then she opened them. Thank you, Frank, she said. Daniel wants to know if you can come by the house tonight. Tell him yes, she said, after 6. She went back to Ruben and his paperwork and finished what she had started, because Ruben's blood sugar and his broken glasses and his 4 years without a doctor did not pause for the resolution of other people's crises. She wrote his answers in her steady handwriting and walked him through the last 2 pages and handed the completed form to Dr. Voss's assistant and watched Ruben get called into the back and felt the specific satisfaction of a thing completed that mattered to the person it was done for. Then she went into the small supply room that Dr. Voss used as a break room, and she sat in the chair by the window, and she let herself feel the Wednesday morning borough fully for the first time since it had started. Brass was in custody. She was safe. The slow car, the crash, the rain, the 45 seconds of argument with herself before she stood up and ran toward the sound of screaming. The 14 stitches, the blood-stained jacket, the note on hospital notepaper, the payphone on 12th Street, the signed statement, the real bed, the good coffee, the intake forms. All of it had been moving toward this morning without her knowing it, the way rivers move toward the sea without being able to see where the sea is from inside the current. She sat with all of it for 10 minutes. Then she got up and went back to work. By the time she arrived at Daniel's house that evening, the energy inside it was different from anything she had felt there before. There were more people, not a crowd, but more than the quiet household she had been moving through for the past weeks. 6 or 7 people she recognized from various edges of the chapter's orbit, people who had been in the field during the search, people Frank had introduced in passing. One woman named Deb, who ran the chapter's family support network and who had a laugh that filled whatever room she was in. Liz was up, really up, not in the recliner, not in the brace, moving carefully but moving. And when Sophie came through the door, Liz crossed the room to her with a steadiness that was different from last week, like the leg had decided it was done being a limitation for tonight. She put both hands on Sophie's shoulders and looked at her. You okay, Liz said. Yes, Sophie said. Frank told you this morning. He called while I was helping someone with paperwork, Sophie said. I finished the paperwork first. Liz looked at her for a moment. Something moved across her face, that thing Sophie had first seen in the rain, that unnameable thing that she now had a better name for. It was recognition. It was the look of one person seeing another person clearly and finding exactly who they expected. Of course you did, Liz said. Daniel was across the room talking to two men. Sophie half recognized, and when he saw her, he excused himself and came over, and he shook her hand. Not the greeting handshake, the other kind, the one with both hands and real weight behind it. It's over, he said. Is it actually over? Sophie said. Brassy will have lawyers. He'll have lawyers, Daniel said. But Ortega has the road evidence, your timeline, Pete's testimony, and 8 months of their own investigation. She was building a case that didn't need us to win. We just helped her close the last gaps. He paused. It's over, Sophie. Sophie looked at him. She believed him. That was the thing. She had arrived at the place where she believed him, and she couldn't identify the exact moment when that had happened, just that it had somewhere between the diner on Van Buren and the paperwork this morning and all the days in between. Margaret, she said, have you talked to her today? She's coming later, Daniel said. Carmen's bringing her. Sophie nodded. There's something else, Daniel said. His voice shifted, not heavier, more deliberate, like he was placing something carefully. Sit down for a minute. They sat in the 2 chairs by the far wall, slightly away from the rest of the room, the way Daniel always arranged serious conversations, not hidden, just separated enough to be distinct. We've been talking, Daniel said. Liz and I, and Frank, and Patricia Voss. He folded his hands. Dr. Voss wants to formalize your position at the clinic, not just the community health worker role. She's been watching you for 3 weeks, and she wants to build a training program around what you already do, teaching other outreach workers the triage methodology you've developed. She said you have a system that took her 20 years to develop organically, and you built it in 3 years out of necessity, and she doesn't want to let that go to waste on a single clinic. Sophie stared at him. A training program, she said. It would take time to build, Daniel said. You'd still be doing the direct work, but eventually she sees this becoming something larger. A certification program for community health outreach workers who come from the communities they serve. He paused. She said that last part specifically. From the communities they serve, not outsiders coming in, people who already know. Sophie was quiet. That's not the only thing, Daniel said. She looked at him. There's a house, he said, on the south side of Garfield. 3 bedrooms, good condition, chapter-owned property that's been sitting empty for a year. We want you and Margaret to have it, not as charity, as a base, a place where Margaret can be stable and where you can actually rest when you're not working, and where there's room for the kind of informal support network you've been running for 2 years to have a real home. He held her gaze. Margaret knows about this. I asked her before I asked you because I felt like she deserved to be consulted directly. Sophie said, what did she say? She said she'd ask for a better thermos, Daniel said. Sophie laughed. It came out abrupt and genuine and slightly surprised, the way real laughter does when it arrives before you've decided to let it. Daniel's face broke into something that was also real, not the managed expression of a man making a transaction, but the actual face of someone who was glad. Sophie, he said, when the room settled back, none of this is about obligation. None of it is about what you did for Liz. Those things are separate, Boys. What you did for Liz is already complete. It exists on its own, and nothing we do now changes it or pays it back or needs to. He leaned forward slightly. This is about who you are. This is about the fact that you have been doing alone, without support, without recognition, without anything but your own sense of what was right. The exact work that this club has been trying to do in this community for years. You've been doing it better than we have, and we want to support that because it deserves to be supported. Not because of one night, because of who you've been every day before and after that night. Sophie looked at her hands, the healed palms, the faint pink lines. I need to talk to Margaret, she said. Of course, he said. Before I say yes to any of it, I need to talk to Margaret. She'll be here in an hour, he said. Take whatever time you need. Sophie stood up. She needed to move, needed the physical activity of walking through the house, past the people talking, and the woman named Deb, with the large laugh, and the kitchen where Liz was now standing with someone Sophie didn't know, easy and warm, the leg holding. She moved through all of it and out to the back of the house and stood in the open air. The sky was going dark. Phoenix at dusk had that particular quality of color, not beautiful exactly, but honest, the kind of sky that didn't dress itself up. She stood there for a while. She thought about a 16-year-old girl standing outside a group home with a backpack that had everything she owned in it, having just understood that the system that was supposed to protect her had filed her in the wrong drawer and moved on. She thought about the first night under the Morrison Street awning, about learning to read the city the way you read a language, not from a book, but from immersion, from necessity, from making the wrong guess once and not making it again. About Clarence in the food bank, about Margaret's folding chair, and the tape thermos and the questions she had asked on that first night, what do you know how to do? About Reuben this morning, his shaking hands and his broken glasses, and 4 years without a doctor, and the paperwork that Sophie had sat with him through without making him feel small. About a rainy night and a crash and 45 seconds of argument with herself. She heard the door behind her and turned. It was Liz, moving carefully but moving. She came out and stood beside Sophie and looked at the darkening sky and didn't say anything right away. Daniel told you, Sophie said. I was there when he told you, Liz said. I was watching from the kitchen. Were you listening? I was listening, Liz said, not apologizing for it, just confirming. Sophie looked at the scheme and, it's a lot. It is, Liz said. I'm scared of wanting it. I know. I keep waiting for the part where it goes wrong, Sophie said. Some condition I missed, some catch in the fine print. Liz was quiet for a moment. There's no fine print, she said. I know that's what you've learned to look for. I know the world taught you that every good thing has a catch, and every door that opens is probably a door into something worse. She paused. But Sophie, you signed a statement with a detective and told the truth in a room with real consequences. You started a job 3 days after your life was in a different kind of danger. You went back to the paperwork this morning after Frank called you with the news because someone else needed the paperwork finished. She turned to look at her. You already know how to do this. You've been doing it. The only thing that's changing is that now you have the right conditions. Sophie looked at her. What if I mess it up? Sophie said. It came out smaller than everything else she'd said. More honest. More 16 than 19. Liz said, then you mess it up and we figure out the next thing. That's how it works. That's how it works for everyone. Her voice was not gentle in the way that softened things. It was gentle in the way that held them at full weight without flinching. You are not auditioning. You already got the part. This is just the part where you show up. Sophie pressed her lips together. She was not going to cry. She had held this for 3 years without crying, and she was not going to do it in someone's backyard in Phoenix at dusk. But it was close. It was closer than it had been in a very long time. Okay, she said. Her voice was steady. She made it steady. Okay, Liz said. Okay, Sophie said. I'll talk to Margaret. And then yes, to all of it. Liz was quiet for a moment. And then she did something Sophie hadn't expected. She reached out and put her arm around Sophie's shoulders and held her there. Not a hug exactly, more like a mooring. Like you put your arm around someone when you want them to feel the weight of your presence without the performance of an embrace. And Sophie, who had not been held by anyone in longer than she could accurately track, stood inside that steadiness and breathed. After a moment, she said, your leg. My leg is fine, Liz said. You keep saying that. Because it keeps being true enough, Liz said. Sophie almost laughed again. She was doing that more the sudden real laughter, the kind that arrived before she invited it. She was starting to think that might be a sign of something. Margaret arrived 45 minutes later. Carmen brought her in the same way she brought everything efficiently, quietly already done by the time you noticed it was happening. Margaret walked into the house and looked at the room, which had expanded since Sophie arrived. More people now, a warmth to it that came from gathering rather than from any single element. She found Sophie near the kitchen door, and they stood together for a moment without speaking, the way they had always stood together when there was something large to be addressed. Daniel told you, Sophie said. He called this afternoon, Margaret said. Before you got there, showed more sense than I expected. And I told him the thermos thing, Margaret said, which you apparently already know about. He told me. Margaret looked at her. The full look, the reading you look that Sophie had learned in 14 months to recognize as the most honest form of attention she had ever been on the receiving end of. How are you? Margaret said. Not how do you feel about the offer. How are you? I'm scared, Sophie said, and I want to say yes. Those two things can both be true, Margaret said. I know. Are you asking me to talk you out of it? Margaret said. No, Sophie said. Good, Margaret said. Because I'm not going to. Sophie looked at her. You want this? I want you to have this, Margaret said carefully. I've watched you for 14 months hold other people up with your bare hands while you slept on concrete. I've watched you give away food when you didn't have enough for yourself. I've watched you build something real out of nothing with nobody watching because it was the right thing to do and you didn't know how to do anything else. She paused. Yes, I want you to have this. And I'm not too proud to say that I wouldn't mind a real roof myself. Sophie looked at her for a moment. Margaret, who had asked her on the first night, what do you know how to do, who had poured coffee into a thermos lid and held Sophie's hands while she cleaned the scrapes, who had said, just leave the door open. The house has 3 bedrooms, Sophie said. Daniel mentioned any of that, Margaret said. You'd have your own room, Sophie said. I assumed, Margaret said, with the faintest dry edge that was the closest Margaret usually came to humor. And your medical needs, Sophie said. Dr. Voss will take you on as a patient. That's part of it. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Sophie watched her face, which almost never moved enough to read unless you'd been watching it for a long time, and she saw something move across it now, something deep and involuntary and immediately controlled the way you control things you've been trained to control by years of not letting yourself want too much. Margaret, Sophie said softly. I'm fine, Margaret said. I know you're fine, Sophie said. I'm glad. Okay, I'm glad it includes you. Margaret looked at her. You made it include me. You were already included, Sophie said, from the beginning. You're the reason I could leave any door open at all. The room was loud around them. Deb's laughed someone in the kitchen. Daniel's voice from somewhere toward the front, but between Sophie and Margaret, it was quiet. In the specific way it was always quiet between them. The way 2 people are quiet when they have already said everything important in all the smaller moments. And this one is just the one where they look at each other and know it. Yes, then, Margaret said, to all of it. Yes, Sophie said. They stood there together. Later that night, when the house had settled into the particular quiet of people who have eaten and talked and felt something real and are now simply present together, Sophie found herself at the kitchen table with Liz and Daniel and Margaret and Frank and Deb and 2 others whose names she had learned that evening, and she sat in the middle of it and felt the shape of it. Not just the room, the whole shape. The rain and the crash and the 45 seconds and the note on hospital notepaper and the payphone and the diner and the slow car and Pete and Ortega and the signed statement and Ruben's paperwork and the house on the south side of Garfield and this kitchen table. Deb was telling a story about something that had happened at a chapter event years ago that apparently everyone at the table had a different version of, and the disagreement about the versions was funnier than any single version. And Sophie sat and listened and felt the laugh arrive in her chest before it arrived on her face, and she let it come, and she laughed. Daniel looked at her when she laughed. Just for a second. The look of a man who noticed something he had hoped to see and was not going to make a production of seeing it. Liz across the table caught Sophie's eye. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. In the weeks that followed, life became something Sophie had no existing vocabulary for. Because the vocabulary she had was built for surviving, and this was not surviving anymore. The house on Garfield came through in the second week clean, solid, close enough to Margaret's old parking structure that Margaret could still see the people she had been looking after, which mattered to Margaret in a way that Sophie understood completely. They moved in on a Tuesday, which felt right for reasons neither of them articulated. Margaret put her chair by the window in the front room and her thermos on the table beside it, and Sophie stood in the doorway of her room for a long time with her hand on the doorframe and breathed. The training program was slower. Dr. Voss was thorough in a way that took time, and building something real took longer than Sophie's instincts wanted it to. But she was learning that not everything had to move at survival speed. Some things grew better at the pace of intention. She went back to school in the evenings, online classes 2 nights a week in the direction of the credentials that Dr. Voss's program would eventually require. She was, as she had told Daniel in the hospital room, smart, and she was learning that smart meant something different when it had room and time and support. It meant you could go further than you had been able to go alone. She called Clarence every Wednesday. She went to the food bank on Thursdays, not as a recipient now, but still as a presence, still knowing where to stand, who needed what, how to move between the person who had something and the person who needed it. That part of her had not changed. She didn't want it to change. Pete came back to the food bank after 2 weeks. He found Sophie there, and he stood in front of her with the specific misery of someone who understood what he had done, even though he hadn't meant it, and he said, "I'm sorry, I didn't know what he was using me for. I should have known better." Sophie looked at him for a moment. She thought about the ways she had learned to assess a person, not by their worst decision, but by what they did after, by whether the remorse was real and the understanding was real and the willingness to stand in front of the person they'd hurt was real. "I know you didn't mean it," she said. "Come back on Thursday and help with the lunch line. That's how you make it right." He came back on Thursday. That was also how things worked. 3 months after the arrest, Ortega called. "Brasse pled out," she said. "Vehicular assault conspiracy, 3 other counts. He's looking at 12 to 15. He won't be out of federal custody before you've finished your degree, your certification, and whatever you build next." Sophie sat at the kitchen table in the house on Garfield with the phone against her ear and the morning light coming through the window. "Okay," she said. "That's it," Ortega said. "Okay. I mean, thank you," Sophie said. "And okay." Ortega was quiet for a moment. Then, "I checked in on the outreach program. Dr. Voss sent me the preliminary proposal for the certification track." "It's early days," Sophie said. "It's impressive early days," Ortega said. "I have a contact at the city's Department of Community Health. They've been looking for exactly this kind of model, peer-trained, community-embedded. I'd like to introduce you." Sophie was quiet. "That's a bigger thing," she said. "Yes," Ortega said. "It is." "I'll think about it," Sophie said. "That's all I'm asking," Ortega said. And Sophie recognized the line, the same line Daniel had used, the same line that meant, "I know you'll say yes when you're ready. I'm just making sure the door is there." She was learning that some doors didn't need to be pushed. They just needed to stay open. Margaret came into the kitchen while Sophie was still sitting with the phone. She looked at Sophie's face, read whatever she read there, and went to put the kettle on without asking. "Good call," Margaret said. "Brass pled out," Sophie said. Margaret turned from the kettle. She looked at Sophie for a moment. "Then it's done," Margaret said. "Then it's done," Sophie said. Margaret turned back to the kettle. The sound of water heating. Morning in a real house, a table with chairs around it, and people who would come to fill those chairs. Sophie looked at the window, at the ordinary light. She thought about a rainy night, about 45 seconds of argument, about the rules she had broken and what the breaking had opened. She thought about Liz's hand in hers on the wet road, about the note on hospital notepaper, about the card in her jacket pocket, about Margaret's thermos, about Ruben's broken glasses and Pete in the lunch line and Clarence on the phone every Wednesday and Deb's laugh and a kitchen table full of people who had learned her name, about a door she had left open and what had walked through it. Not luck, not accident, not the rescue narrative that the world liked to tell about people like her, the ones that had failed and then noticed too late and made into symbols. Not that. Something truer. A girl who had learned the hard way what it cost to survive alone and who had also learned slowly, incrementally, one terrifying inch at a time that alone was not the only option. That trust was not a trap, not always. That showing up in the dark for someone you didn't know was not a mistake, even when the world had spent years teaching you that it was. That the things you had survived did not have to be the ceiling of what you were capable of. They could be, if the right conditions finally arrived, the foundation. Sophie Williams was 19 years old. She had been homeless for 3 years, and she had survived those 3 years by learning every rule of a world that did not want to see her. And she had kept every person she loved alive inside those rules. And then one rainy night, she had broken the most important rule she had made for herself. Don't get involved in other people's problems, and it had not destroyed her. It had brought her here, to a kitchen table in a house on the south side of Garfield, with morning light and a kettle heating, and a woman who had been her anchor making coffee without being asked, and a phone in her hand that had just told her the man who had tried to silence the truth was going away for 12 to 15 years. In a job she went to every morning that was exactly the work she had always done, except that now someone was paying her for it and building something larger around it. And a woman with gray eyes who had looked at her in the rain and in the daylight and always seen the same thing. Not a problem, not a symbol, not a cautionary story, a person. And that was the whole story, not the crash, not the rescue, not the arrest, not the program or the house or the table full of people. The whole story was the moment a 19-year-old girl who had been told in every way the world knew how to tell it that she did not matter, decided in 45 seconds on a rainy night in Phoenix that the woman screaming in the dark mattered more than the rule. And then the world slowly and perfectly with the particular awkwardness of something large, correcting a long-standing wrong, decided in return that so did she. Sophie Williams had started with nothing, and she had given everything she had, and what came back was not what she had given. It was more. It was a life, her actual life, the one she had been surviving toward without knowing it, and she was finally at 19 just beginning to live it.